Are you ready? Is everyone ready to begin?
So
we start with the roll call. Committee Member Cooper.
Here.
Committee Member Larson.
Here.
Committee Member Martin is not here. Committee Member Peterson.
Here.
Vice Chair Sear is on her way. And Committee Member Way.
Here.
Chair Smithies.
here.
So we have a bit of an untraditional format for you this evening, so I thought I'd make a brief announcement on your format, and I can answer questions if you have them. This is a study session, so it's a little different than your traditional meeting. You're each going to, I know we've briefed you on this, but you're each going to give a presentation, and then there'll be time for committee Q&A, but not any discussion until after public comment. So for those members of the public comment comes after the 4 committee presentations, as well as the consultant presentation. And then after public comment, the committee will bring it back for discussion. So that Q&A portion between your presentations is just questions. Any questions about that format? We have our consultants here who can also answer questions, but we don't have much time for Q&A, so some of the questions you may have may come up in the discussion for the consultants, so we can kind of do it that way too. It's good?
Great. And then on that note, we can begin. So we'll begin at 2 to 1 with our consultant presentation.
So I'd like to invite our consultants up. You can introduce yourselves, and they're going to give a brief overview of their work to date and what we're planning to do for the next few months.
Good evening. My name is Julia Chang-Frank. I'm with Cascadia Consulting Group. I'm the co-director of their Oakland office, and I'm also an Albany resident. This is Ryan Gardner, and he's with Rincon Consultants. Cascadia has conducted greenhouse gas inventories, climate action plans, and many boots-on-the-ground implementation of the mitigation strategies, such as EV charging station infrastructure, residential energy efficiency projects, and zero-waste planning throughout the Pacific Northwest. And I'll let Ryan talk about his role, Rincon Consultants, and also BAE Urban Economics, which is another firm within our team.
Thanks. So Rincon Consultants, we are located in Oakland. We have other offices kind of throughout California. We have been working on climate action plans since the first round of climate action plans with cities all over California, San Luis Obispo counties, Pasadena. We're working Vista, a few others down south, and right now we're working on kind of this CAP 2.0, this round of updates, both on several projects with Cascadia, with Albany and City of Dublin, and also County of San Mateo, and we're working on a few other climate action plans, City of Sacramento's update, County of Merced, Metropolitan Water District, and a few other cities down south like South Pasadena and Walnut. So we're kind of a technical greenhouse gas specialist, really look on the quantification and really focused on implementation moving forward. Also on our team for this project, which is great, is BAE Urban Economics. Both Cascadia and Rincon kind of identified funding as one of the real limiting factors for implementation of the first round of climate action plans. And yeah, if you don't have money to pay for these projects, it's really hard to get them done. So BAE has been working to really provide a list of funding opportunities, both kind of traditional ones, but also outside the box programs. We've been looking at on-bill financing, some programs for aligning incentives between owners, tenants, and utilities and buildings, and then also some cool funding like green fund programs and things like that. So they'll be contributing that analysis as well down the line.
Great. And as Ryan mentioned, we're partnering, and we've done these partnerships with other cities, so we will bring that into our analysis. Our approach is to provide the most impactful, achievable mitigation strategies for the City of Albany. We bring our team's implementation experience and our knowledge of regional and local efforts to inform that analysis. And our hope is, rather than provide like a laundry list of mitigation strategies, we're focusing on providing streamlined strategies that are the biggest bang for your buck. What we've done so far is staff has been really strategic about how to utilize our consultant budget. So they're focusing our work in the highest and best use of our time. So for example, we helped design the public engagement workshop back in January, but Lizzie and Claire did the heavy lifting of the implementation and planning. We've also created discussion guides for this committee, as well as stakeholder groups, the community survey, and also the city staff interviews. So to develop our mitigation strategies, we analyze the results from all of those efforts. And we are proposing strategies that reflect the priorities of the city, staff, this committee, and also all of the public engagement that's happened around this climate action plan effort so far. Our goal tonight is just, first of all, we just recognize that there's a lot of expertise within this committee. And so we really just want to hear how you came to the decisions you have for the priorities that you've picked within your subcommittees. And once we understand how and why you came to those decisions, we'll incorporate that into our deeper analysis of those mitigation strategies. We plan to analyze not only the financial impacts, but how to capitalize on the latest regional and state policy efforts and lessons learned in the field. The goal of the deeper dive will be to either validate the prioritized CAP strategies or refocus and refine them to be more data-driven, depending on the results. So, timeline, this is April. Once the short list of strategies has been developed, which we're hoping will be part of the outcome of this meeting, our team will conduct the in-depth analysis, and the results will be ready for your review by the May Climate Action Committee meeting. And then based on that feedback, the draft climate action plan will be discussed at the June 14th Climate Action Committee. And thereafter, staff will present that draft report to city commissions and committees. July 15th will be the City Council work session of the draft climate action plan, and thereafter a closure of public comment. Then we'll take that, that information to finalize the CAP and develop an implementation plan. Our final report for presentation will be at the September Climate Action Committee, and then the City Council presentation will be in October. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And then concluding our consultant presentation, we'll now move on to our subcommittee presentations, beginning with the Energy Subcommittee. And just a reminder is that we're trying to keep these presentations around 10 minutes.
And we're actually going to set a timer just to help people stay on track. So you'll see when it turns yellow, you'll have 30 seconds left.
Okay, well, I think I'm up. So Nick Peterson, and the subcommittee was Max Way, Eric Larson, and myself. We got together and talked about it. I don't know if we can get...
The slides are on the computer. Do you want me to pull them up?
Oh, yeah. Okay, so I'll just go up there. I'll let you set it up. So it's going to be hard to see.
Might be easier if you put the screen down, Claire. Because it's the light behind it is making it even
Window
more.
shade.
I just emailed that.
There's no curtains anymore.
Okay, so we met and we went over the matrix that you had provided, and there were a lot of really good things on there. I mean, it was going in the direction we thought it would be going. So one thing here I thought, at least it's on this screen, it isn't on that screen, it isn't on your screen. So I don't know what that means. Is this going to that? Anyway, energy really equals electrification, and that's going to be a big push for us. And for those who don't know, it's a big deal because Albany now has 100% of their electricity coming from East Bay Community Energy on a carbon-free basis. So as much as we can switch over to electrical usage, it comes from a clean source, and that will help reduce our carbon footprint. Yeah. Well, anyway, it's very difficult to see that. I wish I could pull a curtain back there or something we should get. Just a curtain.
By turning the light.
So,
You turn the lights down? That's better.
so actions with the highest rating, which we thought were really doable. I mean, these all have really big challenges. As you can imagine, fuel switching, both in transportation and in building heating, is going to be a big hurdle. So one thing that kept us sort of a little more focused was thinking this is a plan that's going to go for, well, the next milestone is in 15 years, and then there's another milestone 15 years after that. So 30 years hence, in 2050, Albany is going to be carbon neutral. But that doesn't mean we just keep kicking the can down the road, and we need to do things. So realistically, it means right now starting to do things that are very achievable. So with the ramp up and the improvements in electrical vehicles, there should be a big incentive for people to turn more to electrically powered vehicles or hydrogen. I think fuel cell is in there as long as the hydrogen is made with clean energy and not out of oil-fueled power. That's a little bit more complex, but we didn't. When I talk electrical vehicle, I just mean non-carbon emitting vehicle, usually a non-internal combustion engine vehicle. So to promote that is we want to look at innovative ways of trying to get charging infrastructure out there, especially in multi-unit residential, which is a big hurdle for a lot of people. Landlords aren't, and property owners aren't really interested in spending large amounts of money trying to get separately metered EV charge stations for every tenant in the building. So how could you do it more economically? And we came across this idea of a smart cable technology where the cable itself, when you plug it into a certain type of outlet, then meters the usage and over cellular technology bills the user for the amount. So it doesn't matter where the power is coming from. Yes, it's draining the power, but they get reimbursed for it. That's relatively new. The only ones I know about are in Germany. I think there's a pilot project in somewhere in Southern California where they're trying this. This also taps into when you have outlets that would be on light posts or in the public venue. It makes it much more easier to track and keep and manage power usage and sell the power rather than just having to give it away for free, which then doesn't give you a revenue stream for doing this. The other thing we thought about was negotiating more with these third-party charge point entities to try to make Albany a place where they will come and install their chargers. Again, we don't know a whole lot about that. We're just sort of throwing that out there. And I think that was also brought up in the consultant's report as something to look into. So the other big thing we thought about was electrification in buildings. And with a goal, actually that should say 35. I think later on I said 35. Now with making it mandatory for everything by 2035, which is a reasonable time away, that if we start notifying people and people start coming up with their plans, they can work towards that. Again, that's going to be what we've realized is doing strictly 100% volunteer implementations of these kind of changes aren't going to come about. People won't do them. They're complicated, they take cost, and if no one's really indicating that they're urgent or need to be done, they're just not going to be done. So the whole thing we kind of discussed and talked about was some way to incentivize or some revenue generating method, either through taxes or a fee or something, where it can roll in gradually, so people aren't clobbered with this right from the get-go. And with a 15-year time period, we think that does allow it. So, I mean, these are all just very broad thoughts, starting with the requirement in new construction. This one is actually maybe the only urgent one. New construction, major remodeling to be all electric there's a new code issuing, going to be adopted in Albany in 2020. And adapting with that at least new projects, and those aren't a lot, but the thing is every time a new project gets built, that means you've clocked in for 50 years how they're going to consume energy and produce carbon. 25 to 50 years before they change that system again. And what you're really doing is you're setting new builders and new developers up to be hit later with even more cost when, as we get closer to our zero in 2050, they're going to have to spend more to convert what could have been done earlier in a much more efficient manner. So we think the sooner you can get that in place, the better, because we stop digging the hole with new structures. It's also critical now because Albany's gone through somewhat of a change of its parking requirements, which were due to state mandated issues to generate more housing. And that has seen a big upswing in people interested in either in building in Albany and in building new residential units, or at least doing major remodels of their home that would have triggered parking before. So we want to encourage that, but we also want people to think about electrifying at that point when they're doing a major remodel. So that was one bullet point. And then requiring existing homes to have some sort of rating, either energy score, or maybe we can use the climate-free Albany rating system as it gets more sophisticated, but just requiring that, again, this could ramp up. They do the rating, and then there would be a minimum score. If you're going to sell your home, it's like getting your sewer lateral improved. If you're going to sell a home, it's got to meet a certain minimum rating. So maybe you do some attic insulation, or you convert the gas water heater to a heat pump water heater, or some simple action that you can get those points to where you can go. And then we'll keep ramping it up, where by 2035, it has to be completely a net zero home. Let's see, develop fee for, so again, thinking of, we were just trying to think of, you need a revenue stream because all this stuff it becomes pretty intense on staff to monitor it, track it, enforce it. And so there was some idea of maybe looking at utility taxes. That gets complicated. We know it's messy. And you could ramp up taxes on gas, ramp down taxes on electricity, and as that would provide incentives also. Anyway, let's see. With sort of the lower incentives, this was not so much because they weren't good ideas, but also we think there would be a lot of resistance, although hopefully, as I see, there being resistance. I mean, nobody wants to be told to do certain changes, and we're trying to think of ways to blend them in so they come about in a more willing way. But anyway, either not going to be as effective or there'd be a lot of resistance. So one was the idea of creating parking zones and parking permit requirements. And that, of course, everyone is about. Another community outreach, again, we feel that anything that just plugs doing volunteer stuff isn't going to be successful. People won't end up doing it if they're not required to. And then maybe designating a climate emergency to try to up the urgency. But again, that was something we weren't too fit in. So the big focus was on the fuel switching and electrification from the energy standpoint. Should I stay here, or we're just going to go through?
You can stay there for Q&A.
Committee members only, right? Okay, so actually my other subcommittee members, Max and Eric, I wanted to give you some time to sort of comment on it, if I left anything out that you remember.
Well, what I was just going to add was for the consultants, two things is, one is, especially the electrification of houses, Albany is really good about passing bond measures for things that are popular, schools and sidewalks and that sort of thing. So we were like, how do we make this the kind of concept, the kind of idea that is so popular that people want to pass these measures? And so it's sort of advertising and and couching it the right way, as well as sort of implementing these things. So that was.
I think this is a slide I didn't get, which was sort of to you guys. That's sort of the second main bullet there, city residents outreach and education, really getting everybody on board. We've done some things, I think we've gotten good turnout, but again, we're talking about, if we get, we want to get thousands of people, not just tens of people. So again, I think that's where this plan needs to have in its implementation something for almost like a PR and outreach. Max, did you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to echo that. I was going to mention that as a common theme for all of our, this one and the transportation one was really the information and information availability, making that available to members of the public, and outreach. And so that could be something like the ways to use active transportation. I guess I'm going into the next one, but also the benefits and incentives of some of these things, and information, just very basic information, which we may assume that people are familiar with and know about, but it's not really necessarily the case. The other thing I just wanted to mention were the all-electric, on your first slide, Nick.
You want me to go back to that?
Yeah, it was just on the making all new construction all-electric with rooftop PV. So anyways, I think that one has been, there have been several studies, I think one at Sacramento Municipal Utility District. And I'm actually leading a study which will be released very soon, just showing that the life cycle cost for all-electric buildings is very competitive with mixed-fuel buildings, especially if you do not need to build new natural gas infrastructure. So it can be very economic to both, economically and also to save carbon, to build all-electric new homes.
Yeah, and I think what we also discussed, and Eric, maybe you remember this, would be helpful is have some examples, like here's your typical major remodeling, adding a second floor in Albany on your, no house is typical, but sort of the average thing. And here's, instead of doing this, you can do this, and comparing the costs and showing. I think if people can get that information, that's very, very helpful to them, especially when you're doing a new addition, you haven't really done that before. You're depending on your designers and your contractors to really tell you, and they're more embedded in maybe an older way to do things. So outreach to professionals is another thing we need to do.
Yeah, I wonder if we can add a couple more minutes on the clock. I just wanted to clarify that in general, we want to keep the presentations themselves in like less than 10 minutes. So when we hear that beep, be done with that and move on to questions. But I understand that this is our first presentation. So would it be possible to add a couple more minutes? I think we have room.
Do other people have questions?
Yeah.
How much time do we have for questions?
You have a minute and 15 seconds left.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess we can start with that and just go down
Start with
the
that, and
line.
then we can go from there.
So this is something we've talked about for many years in terms of being able. Oh, this one? The electrification and dealing with existing homes and apartments has been something we've talked about for many years. So, because if we just are looking at time of sale, that's not going to impact the housing stock in any significant way, because as we've talked about, it's just that there's not that much of a turnover. So I'm curious if you had any more detail in terms of your discussion about how to change people with existing homes, how to get people to do that, because it's going to cost a lot of money. To some people, it's going to be unaffordable, and So I'm curious about the discussions about how to achieve that.
Well, we didn't come up with any solution. So, I mean, the idea here is electrify all buildings, including existing. So underneath that bullet that said point of sale, well, then it would also be other buildings. So there'd be some date, you know, people would have to, again, it goes back to kind of like we were talking about energy score, but make like almost a mandatory energy score. So you would pick a date whereby people would be able to plan and work towards that. And then you would have some kind of incentive system that would be based on, the best thing it'd be based on is whether if you've done something, you should benefit from that. So using more electricity, less gas, you know, the thing throttles the other way, and it just gets progressively and progressively more burdensome, and that would be an incentive. Again, that's just an idea. I mean, I don't know how you solve it. I mean, if you know, in a real world, if you absolutely mandate this stuff, I could see some people leaving Albany because they're just saying, I'm not going to do it. I mean, you're not going to be able to, you know, I think it gets into more complicated setting things up, which probably goes way beyond what we can talk about here, and certainly is a question to you. What do you do about people on fixed incomes and, you know, blah, 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 blah.
Well, even people who aren't on fixed incomes, it's a burden too.
So just quickly, there are a couple of points. One is if there's a revenue-producing measure which is intended to offset the tax that is being taxed, like a UUT consumption tax on natural gas, which is inclining over time, for example, as a revenue-producing measure which can then offset some of the additional costs for electrified end uses for heating. And then the second thing, just to comment on, is that recently I heard the news that PG&E is applying for higher rate increases in natural gas, driven by the reduction in revenues for natural gas heating because the recent years have been much warmer due to climate change. So they're applying for, I think, a 6% annual increase. So there's a, you know, if those are approved, that's a very steep hike in the natural gas rates. So that's a contributing factor which will make it less attractive to stick with natural gas.
One of the things that we're thinking might be clear.
Could you use the mic because we're recording? Thanks.
Yeah. So I think this is like the hardest problem, right? And thinking of equity and who's going to pay for all this stuff. And some of these buildings, like I just moved into a new building in Oakland that has like the absolute worst electric system in the world. Like you'd have to rewire the entire house if you were going to electrify it. And one of the ways we're looking at potentially doing that is like working with EBCE. They now have an incentive to get more people buying electricity. So if they could come up with like an on-bill financing scheme where they're putting the money up front, SMUD has been doing some of this work already, and they're finding that that investment of like paying for those house upgrades up front gets them a better return than almost anything because they're guaranteed that customer and that extra purchase of electricity over time. So there's definitely some things that you can work with like regional partners on to help solve some of those problems. Like the city's not going to have to like do all of that on their own. It's just not feasible. But I'm excited about the on-bill financing and like MEETS, and even PACE is like kind of got a negative connotation in the past, but I still think it's a really positive program. And for things like doing a big building upgrade, you can do some tax work and use like a PACE funding program and get a good amount of money with a good payback over time.
Thank you.
I'm assuming
pass.
Leslie, you don't
Yeah.
have it. Yeah. Committee Member Martin, did you have any questions?
I was on the committee, so go ahead.
No. And then I just had a quick question to clarify. You mentioned two different numbers on your second slide, 2030 and 2035. Did you have a
It should be
reason for this?
2035. Well, 2035 is when we're
The
supposed
end
to
of
be
our-
60%. 2035 is the next milestone for 60% reduction. And just thinking 15 years out, you know, realistically, folks, we should be done by 15 years from now because we're already screwed the pooch. But anyway, again, just trying to fit it into what our current cap plan is, that we know, and no one's, I mean, maybe Max has done a little bit of back of the envelope calculating on this, but knowing we're not going to get 100% of everybody to do this stuff, if we can get a certain number by that time, that's the milestone we want to hit.
Did you have any questions? Okay, great, thank you for pushing us ahead. And so then we'll move on to our next presentation, which will be from the Transportation Subcommittee. And again, just making sure that we keep these at 10 minutes. When you're up there, you can actually see the clock right on the podium, so that might be helpful.
It's at the bottom, the dock. It's one of the PowerPoints, or it should be. If you go all the way to the bottom of the, there you go, over next to the Chrome one. There you go.
Right, so transportation. So we focused on both converting from fossil fuels and some electrification. So there's a little bit of overlap there, but we started off with active transportation. It's already a very popular concept: biking, walking, anything that's active, it's healthy, it's popular, it feels good. It's one of those kind of things we think that people can get behind as a, hey, this is a really inexpensive way to start reducing fossil fuel consumption. So that was one of our first things, but it's not clear the climate benefits. It's hard to quantify that. So, taking cars off the road or miles, not used, that sort of thing. So could use some help with that. So then a little bit more of an aggressive thought was starting to have parking fees for Albany residents. So actually having you register and pay for parking in the city of Albany. Making, of course, gasoline cars more expensive and electric cars exempt or less expensive, that sort of thing, in order to, incentivize that transition. So we realized that may be an unpopular thing. It's a tax. It's an extra cost for something that you've always had for free. So there's that. How do you get over that hurdle, kind of thing. And then, of course, enforcement as well. We're like Nick said, we're conscious of the staff that we have and the ability to enforce this kind of thing. Protected bike lanes. There's been a lot of work done on bike lanes and getting to the point where we actually have protected bike lanes on the major routes and making it, getting that bigger group of people involved in biking, the ones that are not so sure of themselves on the road, and just making it much safer was one of the things we were talking about. On the con side, there's a cost there, but we thought if it's just a simple concrete curb in the street, hopefully that's not too expensive, I don't know. And then, again, the overlap with EV, we really want to promote that as far as one of the transportation options and increasing the ability to get EV charging stations in the city, into the residential streets. We were talking about things like, if you have one at your house, could you share that? Is there some way to make that available in this day and age of apps? There's a lot more access to information like that. So making Albany much more on the map in that respect might help get people into EVs. On the con side, the cost and ownership and the requirement, the liability and all that, and maintenance of charging stations was of course one of the things considered. Things that were more aggressive that we came up with that we wanted to at least, put on the list, but there was the idea of what things that had lower ratings was like a gas tax that, we were talking about wanting to make, this incentive so that if you make the thing you don't want to use more expensive, but that would be really hard to enforce. I mean, if you did that to the Albany gas stations, they'd go out of business probably, so we don't want to do that. But anyway, just put it out there. And then parking meters, and with the recent the Solano Avenue thing, there's a lot of talk about parking meters. We put this on the lower ratings because we think this is being covered with a lot of different aspects of the city planning. So, but of course, the business owner concerns. So things that we would still have questions about, like I said, the impact of active transportation. We live in such a mild climate, flat city. It's a great active transportation opportunity. So just help with how to quantify and evaluate that and how to promote, incentivize. And then the parking fee idea, how would we actually measure that? How would we implement it? What would the impact be? Those are the kind of questions we came up with. Right. Okay, that's what we covered.
Perfect, thank you so much. And then we'll just, again, begin down the line with Greg Cooper.
Did you look at things such as how to get residents out of their cars, to like taking kids to high school or middle school, or to improve mass transit in any way?
Yeah, Allison, you had a lot of thoughts on that. Do you want to?
Yeah, thank you. So as a high school student who bikes to school, I've noticed that a lot of people drive their kids to school or drive themselves to school. And I think one of the reasons is that biking to school is actually a little bit perilous. So the idea of increasing, I mean, I was taken out by a car door opening in like the gauntlet between like the slow moving cars and the parked cars on Portland. And it's either that or like right on the sidewalk, which is possibly not super legal. So the idea of having more bike lanes could definitely help that. So if there was a bike lane on Portland next to the cars, that would increase the safety, would make me more comfortable biking to school. Also, I mean, just in general, getting it out, that it's so not necessary to drive to school. I know we do have bike to school days, and Samantha works on that, walk and roll to school days. But in general, just more kind of publicity and propaganda in the middle school and high school to get people to bike or walk themselves to school.
And I'm assuming, do you have any other questions? And Allison, I'm assuming you don't have any questions? Or?
I have one thing I want to bring up. So I don't know the feasibility of this, but this was mentioned in our like subcommittee meeting, which is that do you guys know the like business sponsored bike racks on Solano? They're shaped like bikes. They're very cool. So I was thinking, as a way to fund electric vehicle charging stations, we could consider a similar agreement with businesses that would be willing to like sponsor an electric vehicle charging station outside of their business, because that would encourage traffic, like electric vehicle, to park close to their businesses and possibly increase traffic for them. And it would, them being able to put their name on it would probably make a good name for their business. So that just might be something to consider.
I was wondering, yeah, I mean, you have active transportation highlighted, but if you had anything specific about infrastructure for public transit and anything along that line.
Yeah, and I was going to say, the slides that captured sort of our highlights, and the written document has more to it, but we did talk about, for example, shuttles to the different BART stations, especially the El Cerrito Plaza one, because that's a good shopping destination as well as a transportation hub. So having a shuttle from Albany that would be looping to especially the El Cerrito Plaza was something we talked about for disabled, elderly, small children, lots of stuff going around. So as a way of incentivizing more active or non-personal transportation.
Thank you.
Can I just add to that? So I think in terms of the active transportation, there are several items related to biking that we've discussed already. So protected routes, for example, Berkeley has bicycle alleys, for example, greater bike security at the high school, more protected routes to the high school, and perhaps to the other schools as well. One other item that I'd like to mention is potentially more illumination, more street lighting essentially at night. So for me at least, it seems like the city of Albany is very dark at night, and so that could be a deterrent to some active transportation, either walking or biking, and also for safety. So it could have multiple co-benefits potentially.
And we talked about, we're putting in more streetlights, put charging stations on all the street lamp things, so building infrastructure there.
Are you concerned that if you put a EV charging station on Solano in front of a business, somebody's just going to park there all day?
Good question, and our consultants could probably help us out with that.
We have pretty solid parking enforcement on Solano Avenue, so I think we could manage that.
Okay.
Nick, did you have any questions?
Yeah, so on biking, I think as someone who's bicycle commuted for the last 24 years, it's always kind of galled me that bikes don't have a privilege over cars. A lot of times when you come to four-way stops, cars can muscle you out of your own right-of-way. They do it all the time. No car stops all the way at a stop sign. And most bicyclists won't put themselves in front of 4 tons of rolling steel. So they just win. So I was thinking, would there be a way to give yield to bike priority? I mean, has anyone thought about that? You know, where at least on bike path streets, when there's a bike there, they have the right-of-way, or some way to give bikes more right-of-way over cars, because cars just rule the streets. And
That's great thought.
All right, one quick thing, because I do with public transit or active transportation, it's the last mile challenge that's really big. So I just like to encourage the consultants to especially look at that. I took public transit from the city today, and I got off at BART, and I'm like, okay, I have to get to Albany City Hall. I just walked really fast. But that last mile of a shuttle, if you're bringing home groceries, if you're picking up a child, it's not just about, there are multiple groups of populations for whom that is a challenge. And I think we have to really ask those folks, what is it that would help you out to get out of your car, instead of saying everybody should ride bikes? So any evidence or analysis you can do on that would be awesome.
Just a real quick touch on that. I think one of the items that we're looking at or interested in is bike share and scooter share. You guys don't have that now. I think there's challenges to that. Like, I live and work in Oakland, and they're kind of crazy and all over the place, but tons of people use them all the time. Like, it's very effective. City of Sacramento has jump bikes, and those seem to be like the least chaotic form, and they're super useful. Like, they're electric, and you can, like, I'll take the train to Sacramento and cruise like 3 or 4 miles to my office in like 5 minutes in a suit without breaking a sweat. Like, it's super mellow. So I think that opens it up to a lot of people. And then I know BART, for one, is working on, and also some of the other transportation agencies are working with like the Ubers and Lyfts and potential of unmanned and autonomous vehicles down the line. So that's something else that we can kind of look at for being able to take BART somewhere and then doing that last mile with like an on-call type service if you have kids or groceries and that kind of thing.
Quick question, do we know what happened to Lime?
Went out of business.
I don't know that I can speak to that. I think they went under everywhere,
I think they went out.
not just here.
I think they're focusing on scooters now instead of bikes.
illuminate us.
Hi there. So I'm Preston Jordan. I only happen to know this because the Traffic and Safety Commission gets reports on this. And so Lime is sort of retooling to go towards electric scooters. So they haven't rolled that out yet, but they've said they have a plan to do that. So they've sort of been retracting all the bikes or letting the bikes decay by attrition as they tend to do. So, thanks.
All right, well, thank you. I think that wraps up the Transportation Subcommittee. And so now we will be moving on to Consumption and Carbon-Free Economy Subcommittee. So this one.
And each of the PowerPoints is on the computer there.
to? Oh,
No, I don't think, this was just transportation and
all right, so talking now about the green economy and decarbonized economy, I think Stephanie came up with a nice catchphrase, which is putting the eco back in economy, which I kind of like. And so the main thing that we want to talk about is how do economic actions help Albany address climate change? What exactly is a green economy? Recommended actions, and then moving on to questions and further analysis for consultants. And so now talking about how can economic actions help Albany address climate change locally and globally. So the first point is that the goods and services our community consumes indirectly emit more carbon than our direct use of fossil fuels. So talking more about the hidden carbon emissions that we don't necessarily interact with personally. And then next, we can be a local example of a sustainable economy that saves energy and carbon, promotes local jobs and businesses, and helps to shift the larger market. So focusing specifically on how our little city can really have a larger influence on the full economy. And so next to what is a green economy? A green economy is an economy that results in improved human well-being and social equity, while significantly reducing environmental risks and ecological scarcities. It is low carbon, resource efficient, and socially inclusive. So I think there's a lot of different co-benefits that we're seeing here, and a really kind of a broad topic that's hard to break down. And then the next point is a sharing economy. So this is where goods and services aren't owned by a single user, but are temporarily accessed by members of a network, and underutilized assets are shared, either for free or for a fee. And so this can include bartering, renting, collective purchasing, shared ownership, and has the potential really to be sustainable. And then the last point that we want to make about what is a green economy is a circular economy. So instead of talking about single-use products, is the idea of repurposing things and regenerating them through natural systems, and focusing on positive society-wide benefits. And so now we're going to go through the different initiatives that we've been presented with by our consultants. And so the first one is the idea of leading by example. So this is within the city and updating the city's environmental preferable purchasing policy. And so I think this is something that we rated relatively highly. You guys have any comments on that?
I would just say that we make a lot of choices as a city in terms of using our purchasing power and understanding the impact from the manufacturing through the use through the end of life of those products needs to be part of the decision-making process for purchasing decisions of the city.
And it's also something that we think is very doable, considering it doesn't really require any city support or community support, but it's it's easy or task to undertake. And then the next one is reviving Albany's green business program. And so this is the Go Electric, Go 100% Renewable Energy campaign. And the main thing that we're looking at the lever is outreach and permit incentive.
And I just add on that, appreciating the limits of staff time, that any partnering that can be done on that front. We wanted to make this whole idea about the green economy like a positive, appealing go-to approach that supports the economy rather than, cut your consumption in half. So supporting businesses.
This was a program that existed for a long time in Albany. Well, not for a long period of time, but quite a while ago. And residents may choose to shop at businesses that have the sticker from the city that's a certified Albany green business. And so that would be an incentive for the businesses, as well as bringing about some impactful changes to their operations.
And then moving to the next initiative, which is product take back and repair. So again, talking about end of life and lengthening that, and so that's through to continue hosting fix-it clinics, and the main lever there is outreach and policy. I think that one's relatively straightforward. And then the next one is facilitate resource sharing, which we've received a lot of positive community feedback on. And so this would be through tool lending, library, toy swaps, and along that idea. And so that would be mainly through different online resources. So Next Door Neighborhood is always great, and then Carbon Free Albany. And so continuing on, our next action is reducing food waste. So there's a lot of different ideas we have here. One is to support local food with a farmer's market. I know there's already one in El Cerrito, but thinking about other locations potentially. Encouraging smaller portions at restaurants. And then outreach to citizens on storages and recipes, and supporting food donation programs, which again has received a lot of positive community feedback. And we're really talking about partnering with different resources. And then another one is banning plasticware from Albany, which has kind of happened, but not fully, and I don't think has been enforced fully. So talking about how we can really complete that further. And that we're really looking at is with partnering with Stop Waste on ordinances, and also possibly looking to Berkeley and seeing what they've done. I know they have very strict policies on that.
And just one thing to add, like, what's the connection of plastic and our climate action plan? It's because plastic is made of oil, and in fact, the oil industry is ramping up its production of plastics as a way of utilizing its resource. So it's a really powerful direct action that has larger implications.
And then also along that line, I wanted to mention that there's a couple new businesses that are forming in Albany that are really pushing on the zero waste movement and alternative plastics that both Allison and I know pretty personally. And so I think that's also a great connection that we can make there to garner further community support. And then our next action is encouraging healthy, low-carbon food. And I think this is a difficult one because it really requires personal lifestyle changes. And so the main lever there would be education, and just to continue to inform the community, encourage other options. And I think part of this that we've looked at, or at least I'm looking at the high school, is Meatless Mondays, which we're testing out next Monday for the first time. Pretty exciting.
Is that just going to be with high school lunches, or like a, nice?
And the reason behind that is that there's a direct connection between meat production and emissions. So particularly cattle, burps. Methane release is a significant issue in the state.
And so wrapping it up with suggestions and further analysis for our consultants. So I think the main thing is for each action, including a metric, target, and time. So for example, here we have the action of updating municipal environmentally preferable purchasing policy. And then next would be the metric, target, and time. Update EPP by 2020, 100% of city vehicles to be EV/LED by 2030. And then the next one is making the business case, which I think is to talk about the co-benefits with local businesses mainly. And then the last is working on details of green business criteria and incentives, so what that would really look like, and talking about going back to the green business sticker system. That's it. Any other comments? And so then we can open it up to committee questions.
Did you talk about education and communication to the average resident? Because this feels like a topic that is so prone to overwhelming, too much information, not knowing where to turn next. Did you talk about that?
That's in the next piece.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think, a main route, at least what I see, is through the schools, and it's very easy to go directly. I've been starting giving presentations to elementary students about waste reduction, which is kind of at the end of this, but a good starting point, and then also talking about it through the high school. And I think, since we have such a strong support for the schools already, it's a great way to connect to the parents too, and the parents are really eager to get involved. And I think there's also certain parent organizations that are forming out of the schools that are also interested in furthering outreach for this.
So,
And I would add, our list of recommended actions was pretty long on this. So we're aware it may need some paring down to get to the highlights. But we thought this topic needed a bit more discussing because it's perhaps less direct. So we thought it useful to have a long list tonight.
Did you at all talk about air travel and having some sort of impact on people's decision to do that or not? Because seeing as, I know in our carbon-free Albany, it says how much, one of the things you're asked is how much air travel do you do? And that actually, my case ends up being like over a third of the carbon I generate. So has there been any thought about how to do that?
Yeah, I think also as we were going through thinking about what is the city's role versus what role could a community group play. So we thought it was more up to the community groups to push for the individual behavior change, whereas with the city and the plan, we wanted any kind of bigger systemic change might be a better lever for the city.
So I think this is a super meaty topic, no pun intended. So 3 things just to comment on and questions also. The first is on like solid waste and garbage collection. So I think in San Francisco, they set a goal for a reduction in solid waste. So is it possible to have incentives? Because that's something which is a real measurable output on the garbage side, if not on the input side. And the second thing is if we can have a tax on soda, can we have a tax on beef? Because I think that's a direct measure also. And it would be difficult, obviously, but it's something to think about. And then the last thing is just thinking more about banning single use of anything. And I just like to think about Trader Joe's as the poster child for that. All of their packaging, all of the water bottles, everything is just use it and then throw it out. And we know that recycling is kind of broken today. And more generally, I would say, how can we move from single use, single user to multi-use, multi-user in general as a theme overall?
I'd just say thank you. We didn't want to make our list any longer, so thank you for adding those. And there is precedent for some of those things, as you mentioned. So I'd love to add them to the list for consideration. Thank you.
Yeah, and then we can move on to our next presentations, the same subcommittee.
So this topic is about resilience, and we identified different categories of resilience, and we'll go through some of our ideas around that. So in terms of hazards and threats from the climate, where we see these are mainly potential for forest fires. I mean, we've had fires in the Berkeley Hills. There's no reason why we couldn't imagine the fires coming down into the flatlands. We expect the drought will continue, and that the weather in terms of storms and floods will increase along with temperature rise. So there's a number of things related to the fact that we have bayfront property and what's going to happen with sea level rise and what that would do to the our ability to function in terms of commerce, access to the freeway, that kind of thing. And we define resilience as a way that how do we survive various events that we anticipate and don't anticipate in the future. So when we talked about this, what we talked about is building community, that people knowing their neighbors, A lot of this stuff that happened a number of years ago after Loma Prieta, there was a lot of activity in the city where there were activities around getting community blocks and neighborhoods to prepare for earthquakes, and I know that was really true on our block. People got together, they pooled their resources, they made lists of who had what and phone numbers and that kind of stuff, and that's kind of filtered away, at least where I live. And I think that the same applies to dealing with other kinds of climate-related crises that we could face. And so we looked for how do we bring neighbors together in various activities so that people can deal with events, know which neighbors are infirmed or might need help in the event of an emergency. So we talked about trying to various activities to do that, from the city encouraging potlucks to doing some kind of citywide community festival to encourage resiliency types of things, or learning about different options that you have around sustainability, around changing your lifestyle, adapting to changes in climate, and using the existing program, the CERT program, to push some of the climate resilience throughout the city.
Okay, yeah, so we wanted to start off with people because people are our biggest asset, but at the same time, there's a need for infrastructure to help us better deal with heat and storms. So we have a few items here. I think the first is we were reflecting on trees and the role of trees and realizing what really the number one killer related to climate change in many places is heat. So your biggest bang for the buck for cities is to cool down. And with trees, you get the cooling from canopy, not from little ornamental trees, but from trees with canopy for shading. And along with that, we'd like to encourage that the city, in the Climate Action Plan, adopt a specific target for canopy cover. This has been done in other cities, and it really helps to make to move that effort along. So a target we've seen is 33% of the city overall. There's lots of opportunities on San Pablo. The number you all can work on, but that type of target where you're also looking to make sure the benefit is equitably distributed in different neighborhoods. So it's not only trees, but other plants as well contribute to our ability to manage stormwater. So a climate resilient planting guide would be really helpful, and Albany doesn't have to do that alone. Partner with other organizations. They're already out there, already working on it. We can just bring it in. So especially when the city is doing projects on green infrastructure or landscaping, to have a requirement that those plants can handle the impacts and have sequestration. Right, I'll keep going on the green infrastructure. So thinking about where are all the opportunities for cooling, managing water, and also soaking up carbon. So anytime we have new development or redevelopment, to encourage other green infrastructure like pervious pavement and stormwater management. Also cool pavement or cool roofs or green roofs. All of those, all the surfaces in the city can help us to manage heat. And it's been great to see parklets, and this may have come up in transportation, but any opportunity to get away from just solid concrete surfaces and use permeable pavements or bits of greenery. This also has the co-benefit of promoting active transportation and reducing air pollution. And finally, as we think about more intense storms, to keep going with efforts on creek restoration, culverts, to manage those events.
You want to jump in on this?
So one concern we have is that there are parts of our residents that are more vulnerable to climate events than others, young and the elderly and the infirmed. So the idea of the city having a cooling center that they could activate during a time of extreme heat, maybe it's the senior center, maybe it's here, different, spread out in different parts of the city so that residents don't have to travel far to get to them. In terms of forest fires, it's like Albany Hill that we saw as a risk. The bulb is a risk, no residents out there, but the bulb is an area where we could plant a lot more trees. I mean, to Stephanie's point, there's a benefit to increasing shade in the urban core of Albany, but also we have a lot of open space that we could plant a lot more trees. And we talked about CERT and strengthening that and other programs, a way for the city to stockpile masks in the event of forest fires like we experienced this past year, so that residents have a place to go. If Pastime Hardware is out of masks, where do you go? You come to City Hall, and the city will give you a mask. And then we have a big concern, as I mentioned earlier, about sea level rise and how we work with other cities and regional agencies to address that. Should we have a seawall along the, by Albany Beach? Right now, I know that they have a raised roadway as part of the Bay Trail that's not really preventing flooding in the parking lot of the racetrack. So different things like that we need to look at that are concrete measurements to deal with sea level rise.
And so we can move on to questions. I want to really quickly first mention, I realize we're over time, but I think that climate resilience and climate hazards in particular really fits into intersectionality and social justice, which are really big topics in the city of Albany. And I think, while this already has more community support than maybe some of the other sectors that we're talking about, I think really, talking about equity is a great way to garner even more support for these actions. And then I guess we can just move down the line. If Eric, you have any questions to begin with?
No, I don't think so.
Not that I can think of.
So I liked everything you guys said. And I've been participating myself in the CERT program. I noticed there's a real need for information management, like when you talk about doing a canopy study and that. Did you think, or did you discuss at all about how that can be done efficiently? I know getting into certain database programs or whatever, is there a way to do that that's that in an efficient manner, or even that issue of how to handle that? Well, I mean, just like if someone was going to do an inventory of trees, I mean, this is data that people have to keep up to date and everything. So the whole idea of having something, it sounds like something that should be shared, like El Cerrito, I know, is doing a bunch of stuff, and it seems like we could collaborate with adjacent cities on on something that would help us manage that. Yeah.
Yeah, on that point, I mean, it's great now that we have more and more data tools and remote sensing and crowdsourcing of data, geospatial tools. And yeah, I've seen just a quick look, like more and more cities are putting their tree maps online. So yeah, we don't have to invent that ourselves, and I'm sure our consultants are aware of good techniques for that.
You know, one thing that's striking when you drive either direction on San Pablo through El Cerrito or Berkeley, you get to Albany, there are no trees. There are no trees. And I know that this came up in our discussions about complete streets and the master plan, that there's some reasons why fire department or the police don't want trees, but it's remarkable that there are no trees in the median strip, and in many cases we don't even have a median strip on San Pablo. So we could accomplish both transportation issues by calming traffic and by providing a canopy along San Pablo.
Actually, I remembered a question also, just to comment on that. I know, as far as median strips, I'm pretty sure my mom's been advocating to get a median strip on San Pablo, at least because the place where we cross has no light for 2 blocks and no median strip, and it's pretty dangerous. But back to the presentation, could you expand more on cool pavement and how that would be implemented and kind of what it is?
Yeah, so whether you're talking about rooftops or pavement, other surfaces, and Max can probably comment on this as well, there are like finishes you can put on the surface that that reflect more the infrared, so you don't get as much heating stored. So it really can make a dramatic difference in the surface temperatures in cities. And LA is doing some of this.
So would it be like a paint covering for the streets, or like a pale concrete situation, or?
Yeah, I don't know all of the technical details, but I do know it can be accomplished without having to rework the
Very interesting.
concrete.
Yeah, simple example. So yes, it can be different pigment formulations, and it can increase the reflectivity, which is a good thing to reduce the amount of heat absorption. And another simple example of that is a playground. So playground, if it's black, it could get very hot and could get very uncomfortable. But if it was grass or something, it would be much more comfortable and cooler. So I had a couple of questions if there's time. Yeah, the first one was just on the subject of trees. I think it would be really interesting maybe for the consultant perhaps, but just to think about like the relative impacts. Massive tree planting versus like the cooler surfaces or the green roofs. In that, I think everyone agrees that trees are wonderful for many reasons, but they take a long time to get established, like maybe 20 years perhaps. Whereas if we had, we painted all the black roofs in Albany white, we could do that in a day maybe, or a month. So there's just that aspect to consider. Second question was, I really liked how you led with the human element, because there's that very important part of, social connectivity or social capital. And I'm just wondering if there are good examples of other cities that, perhaps Albany could emulate. I'm also wondering if there are any examples of, we love to have parcel taxes, like sidewalks taxes and school taxes, school bond measures. I just wonder if there's ever been a party tax that a city has ever enacted on itself. Yes, a party tax. Collect some money and we can throw really great dashes like 5 times a year. It's kind of facetious, but I'm half joking.
I mean, we do a lot of community things in Albany already, right? There's Dinner with Albany, there's all kinds of events.
They're great events.
But what's not happening at those events is there's no connection to sustainability at any of the events. I mean, there may be encouraging at Dinner with Albany for people to, you know, bring their own silverware and that kind of thing, and there's lots of recycling. But there's no discussion, there's no taking advantage of those opportunities when people are at Dinner with Albany or at Music in the Park or at 4th of July, where we are bringing people together. We should use those opportunities as education and talk about some of these issues that we're raising.
That wraps up our presentation. All right, and now that we've finished our presentations, we have an opportunity for public comment. And so you can go ahead to the mic. I think that we should be okay without a timer. With the timer?
You want to do 3 minutes?
Yeah, let's do a 3-minute timer.
Hello again. Just to go back, I realized on the Lime, just to check back on that, I think part of the reason that they were going away from the bikes and towards the electric scooters is because Berkeley is going to allow, or they're negotiating with Berkeley to allow their electric scooters. So the bike use in Albany was really cut off by the fence at Berkeley, if you will. As far as the actions, I would encourage the committee to set as a goal putting a utility user tax restructuring measure, an additional tax on natural gas on the 2020 ballot. And the model that could be used, I mean, there's a lot of questions around that, but one of the models that could be used is to put it on the ballot to be put into effect if and when the billing system is changed to support it. And this is similar to how ranked choice voting came to the 4 cities in the Bay Area that use it. So San Francisco, Berkeley, Oakland, and San Leandro all voted for ranked choice before that capability actually existed within the county registrar and Department of Elections. And as a result of those measures, then those government agencies went out and acquired the equipment to be able to do it. So I think having a measure on the ballot could help build momentum. That restructuring goal and an additional incremental tax on natural gas is one of the 4 sort of immediate measures that the Berkeley Energy Commission has recommended in its response to the Berkeley Council passing a fossil fuel free Berkeley resolution and a climate emergency resolution. So I think there's more momentum on this than there was 10 years ago when we started this, some of us. And so I think the time to strike is now. And one of the concepts was to have sort of a carrot and a stick approach, and I think I really like the idea of having EBCE be involved, because there's always this question of, if you generate money with an additional tax, what do you do with it? That's effective and possible given the size of our city, and so the cities that would adopt this could all work through EBCE and on bill to support electrification. And I've read some literature that supporting electrification at mid-market, so really making the incentives available to the so that when somebody's water heater breaks, the installer shows up and actually is the vector that tells them, well, there is another option here and it'll be cheaper for you. So that would be the carrot, is to have an additional tax on natural gas. The stick would be to have the restructuring so that all the revenue that's collected from electricity taxes slowly shifts over to natural gas as well over a number of years, a decade or so that people can see it coming and can plan for it, and the stick will grow through time. On the green infrastructure, I think it would be interesting to, if I can have just a few more seconds, there's a lot of spaces between driveways in Albany that are not an increment of parking spaces. They might be 2.5 spaces, they might be 1.5 space, and each of those half spaces is an opportunity to plant a bigger tree than we can fit within our narrow landscape strips on a lot of the streets. So I think it'd be interesting to take a few representative blocks in different parts of the city and look at that and see how many more trees could we get. And that would have a co-benefit of, that could be done with a green swale next to the tree as well, which would both water the tree and help with stormwater management. As far as the sidewalk tax, it's going so well in terms of repairing the city's sidewalks. It's a 10-year tax. I think it could probably be reauthorized sooner than that, potentially, to bring in some of these other ideas, like paying for green infrastructure, because I think the amount of money that it's generating is not going to be needed for repairing sidewalks. It's really been repairing a backlog of damage that accumulated over decades, and that's really getting repaired pretty quickly. So I don't know, 2020 might be a bit soon, but maybe 2022 it gets reauthorized to bring in both lighting, which ties into the EV chargers, and green infrastructure. So we can sort of repurpose and reuse that tax and, maybe propose to increase it or not, but that could be based on polling. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nina Hegazi. I just moved quite recently from Europe, so I actually have a very different point of view on things that might help. So I have a few points. First of all, what I discovered is there's this carbon-free Albany website that you guys are working on. I feel it is a missed opportunity how few times it has come up in the discussion here, because we talk a lot about reaching out to the public, and I'm pretty sure there must have been some money or at least time that went into that website that could be turned into a great app to reach really the whole community. I feel that it would be great to kind of push on smart metering. And, well, I don't know if PG&E already has an app like that, but I know in Sweden, literally everyone has all info in their pockets. So it could be quite good to kind of connect the residents with the city and give them benefits of knowing how their electricity usage is, or collecting points and letting them understand what we were talking about, plastics and so on. There's these apps in Sweden where I lived, and there you could collect points and, for instance, redeem it for cheaper public transport. And that has been working, actually, so that could be a little bit of an incentivizing people to take public transport. Another thing I do feel came up a bit too few times is, I know everyone likes biking in this country, or what I've seen here, and cars, but I feel like car sharing and bike sharing came up too few times, and that is really a trend we're seeing, and especially the citizens here as well. You did take up, Samantha, you did take up a circular economy. Well, it would be great to kind of make it more visible for the public, open spaces, or putting up signs and, that this is a parking space for pooling or so on. That's quite a new concept that I haven't seen so much in Europe. And a last point I would like to take, that when you were mentioning biking to schools, I feel like it is very easy for Albany to only look at Albany, but you need to take into consideration where the end destination of people are, and how the stealing of bike parts has happened to me already here. So I feel like as the city of Albany kind of should reach out and understand where its citizens would take the bike, and kind of partner up and make sure that those bikes can be stored safely, because otherwise people would just like to go with another form of transport. In Sweden also, we have since 2 years maybe that the taxes for repairing things, both clothes and bigger items, fridges for instance, 50%, like the tax is cut in half since 2 years back, so that could be interesting to look into. And the last thing, when we're talking about waste reduction, to maybe actually weigh the waste. I think Max took it up, but that would probably work as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just wanted to also take that opportunity to introduce Nina, and I really appreciate your remarks. Nina Hegazi is a visiting master's student who's actually working with me at Berkeley Lab, and she's doing her thesis on looking at what it would take to make Albany carbon neutral, but more with from a cost-benefit standpoint. So very, hopefully very informative kind of parallel study.
Thank you. And if there isn't any more member of the, or more, yeah. Go ahead. Great.
Hi, my name is Ann Nutt. I just have a few random thoughts, actually probably too many, based on some of the things I heard today. One thought was, I don't know if there's been an effort to sort of connect some of the goals about electrification with the California Energy Upgrade Program, but we did an energy upgrade at our house 2013, and there was no mention of electric heating that was going on then. And I don't know how many people are taking advantage of that now, but there are some incentives for people to do that, and I think a lot of people would like to, and so they should be promoting electrification. Somebody for transportation and electric vehicle charging, there's an app called PlugShare. I don't know if people are familiar with that. When I signed up, we have a hybrid, plug-in hybrid, but we signed up for PlugShare, and my assumption was when we signed up for that was that we were making our charger available to people to use at our house, and so maybe the city could promote that. Somebody mentioned the last mile and getting there, and that's a big thing for me. I used to commute to the city every day, and I wasn't a BART enthusiast, and there are things that AC Transit used to do that if we could ever get them to bring it back would be really helpful in that regard. The F-bus used to run, was one of the only buses that ran all day, and it ran from San Francisco all the way down Solano Avenue. Continued through Berkeley, and that was a lifesaver to people who had to get home in the middle of the day in Albany from San Francisco and not take BART. The other thing was, and that went by the wayside in the early 90s probably. In the late 90s, or up until the late 90s, there was a period where AC Transit had a small shuttle-sized bus that they ran between North Berkeley BART Station and El Cerrito BART Station. And a lot of school kids used it to get home from the high school. But that was very useful, and I used it many times coming home in the middle of the day when I did take BART, when I had to get back quickly. So if we could just get AC Transit to bring back some of the more local, networking kinds of lines, that would be very helpful. They were talking about getting people involved in education on the economics actions. One of the things I would suggest is take advantage of the Albany Activity Guide, because especially if you're talking about education, because Albany does, and I realize it's through the recreation program, but a lot of classes are offered, and it does seem to me that you could offer classes in sustainability, some of the food options people were talking about. There are lots of classes in international cooking in there. You could have something about that. The last thought I was going to suggest was with air travel. I think somebody brought up air travel. I don't travel that much anymore, so it hasn't come up that often for me, but I remember there's a program where you could buy carbon offsets. You could pay for carbon offsets. And I just wonder if Albany could offer that, if Albany could offer to its citizens to buy carbon offsets, to pay for carbon offsets to the city of Albany for the carbon-free program. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you. All right, and if any other members of the public would like to come up and make a comment, now will be your kind of last chance for now. Okay, and then we'll shift now to committee discussion, and we have roughly 30 minutes. Ideally, we'd keep it under 25 because since we're starting to run late on time. But I would like to structure this so this isn't totally open-ended. So maybe if we want to start with 5 minutes to talk in general, and then we can go through each subcommittee if anyone had any general points they wanted to make that kind of fit beyond a specific subcommittee. I was just going to say, I guess it was, I have this. I think that we're getting a little caught up in like who's has the jurisdiction and making sure that we're really recognizing different partnerships that we could make instead of putting it all on us and kind of how we can take advantage of that more. Yeah.
I have one thing to say. I think it'd be really important for us just to get this out, because I know we're a relatively small committee, and not that many people show up to our meetings, and I seriously doubt that most people in Albany know that carbon-free Albany exists. So I think, like, stuff like publicity and like Ann said, definitely, I really like the idea of the Albany Activity Guide. I don't know who makes that, but, I mean, if we could just, Parks and Rec, okay, giving like a big push for carbon-free Albany in that a couple months might be really useful.
Great. And then I guess we can shift to talking specifically to the subcommittees. So we'll begin in the same order. So starting with the Energy Subcommittee, if anyone had specific comments they wanted to make about that.
Just to echo, I think what Preston Jordan suggested for our action plan, I think I'd like to add to our action plan just really supporting this requirement for all electric new construction, drafting on Berkeley somewhat, starting in 2020, which is when the new codes, well, I guess, yeah. So that's when the new codes go into effect. So I'm not sure if it's on that, but I think that's a future, I mean, that's something we'll discuss in a regular.
Yes, exactly.
Another chance.
Yeah, well, I'll just emphasize that too. I think, the plan is putting together strategies for over the next, 30 years. But we have issues that need to be addressed and can be addressed right now. So again, I would like to emphasize that this committee can provide recommendations to the City Council in tandem with the climate action and adaptation plan. So, waiting till everything's all complete, everything's all worked out. I mean, there's certain things I think we've pointed at, and one of them is coming up with some sort of reach code that addresses and times with the new adoption of the new version of the code, diminishing the use of fossil fuels in new buildings. And I think that's something we should move on.
Yeah, and you're not alone in that. There's a lot of work going on with cities in the Bay Area, working to develop the code to do that, whether it's through a REACH code or other types of ordinances. There's going to be a few options, and there should be a lot more talk on that before the 2019 code gets adopted in 2020.
I'm curious from the consultants whether you know of any cities in the United States that are how they are addressing the existing housing and commercial stock in terms of trying to electrify that, and what measures are being used.
Yeah, so the electrification thing is pretty new and pretty unique to California at this point because of the 100% renewable electricity that we're getting. So that's, somebody mentioned that even a few years ago, like electrification wasn't on the mind. If you had someone come do energy efficiency audit, no one was like, oh, you need to replace all this natural gas stuff with electricity. So that's kind of new, but the existing building stock is starting to get analyzed by a few cities. California hasn't done a ton of work as far as ordinances on that. Boulder has one where there's like a energy utilization index level that buildings have to meet, and that's dropping over time. And New York City has actually done quite a bit on that as well. So we've been looking at that as ways to come up with ordinances that would affect existing buildings. There's almost certainly going to be some legal challenge around that. If you were to say, okay, like every building has to meet these requirements now, even though it didn't have to when it got built, sorry. I think it'll eventually come to that, but it's going to be probably a little while before that all gets worked out. So, but new buildings is definitely feasible and legal and will be happening in multiple cities, I think, in the next 2 years. So.
But that's not where our problem is.
Yeah.
Because we have very low turnover. And certainly not a lot of new construction. The renovation, we can.
So that's the one benefit is major renovations that trigger Title 24 will also be subject to that electrification. So that's one way that you can start to get to that existing building stock. But I think you're going to have to phase in over time to get the rest of those buildings.
Right, and then that doesn't even address the rental stock, which is half of Albany. And the obviously the people that are paying the utility bill are not the property owner. So, and in some cases, like the Village, they don't even pay.
Yeah.
It's included. So there's no incentive for people living in the Village to conserve energy or anything.
Right. There's definitely rental efficiency standards in the various cities. Like I know Sacramento has one. It's just outdated and hasn't been used in a long time. So there's a lot of work looking into whether or not those types of standards can be updated. And I'm sure they could. It's really just a political issue at this point.
Because one of the things we face are that a lot of the activity that we're talking about are impacted by the schools, which the city doesn't have authority over, and entities like state, like UC and Department of Agriculture, that kind of thing. So are you looking at the totality of the city and what percent of the issues that the city can actually address versus things that are beyond our control?
Yeah, it's unfortunately really tough to get that granular of data. So if like UC publishes that data, but trying to figure out like what percentage of their electricity use is going to, you guys versus Berkeley is going to be really difficult. We're running into issues right now. We're working on a inventory for Pittsburgh, and we can't even get their commercial data for the whole city. It's not available because of these aggregation rules. So it's a little frustrating trying to get down to that level of granularity. We can do some like back of the napkin type calculations, but we wouldn't have a specific data unless we were able to do something like an app or something where people were self-reporting their data. One thing I wanted to talk about a little bit was having a benchmarking program is another option. So instead of going at like a time of sale requirement for people to do an upgrade, you could just have a benchmarking. There's already a state benchmarking program for commercial buildings over 50,000 square feet. So you could take that as a kind of a starting place and then improve upon that and even include residential buildings. And then City of San Jose just adopted kind of an advanced level ordinance that included audits with that as well. So that's kind of like the first step is you get people to benchmark their energy, you make them have an audit every couple of years, and then the next phase would be, okay, now you have to get to this level, and if you're not there, then you have to do things in the audit. So I think it's going to be, it's really difficult, and it's going to be those steps to get there. You're not going to be able to just all at once say, all right, everybody has to go all electric.
Okay, thank you.
Any other comments? Yeah.
So from I believe the first two presentations, we highlighted our discussion for the energy subcommittee and the transportation subcommittee, the idea of introducing parking fees for Albany. So I'm in strong support of that, at least to explore that further, because transportation is our #1 source of emissions. I think it's at about 50% of our emissions, #1. And #2, vehicles are much more visible to the public eye than heating equipment like water heating and space heating. And the pollution from transportation is far more visible. You can make the case that the reason we have so much dirt on our cars is because there's so many vehicles and trucks. And I think that this is one of the few ways that we can actually access people's attention is through parking, because everyone needs to park. And there's precedent in Berkeley for having such a program, and we could structure it in such a way that the first vehicle is more nominal fee, but if you have 3 vehicles, you really get penalized. And if you have a clean vehicle, then you have, maybe that's free or it's offset. We can also discuss how to allocate the revenue, because that could create, significant revenue, which is kind of constant over time, and make that pitch to the citizens of the city that this can really benefit our health, our children's health, air quality, as well as the planet. So I think there are a lot of pros. Of course, it's not without their cons and opposition, of course, but that's something I think we haven't really considered, and perhaps we can work more closely with other committees, such as the Transportation Committee.
Just to follow on that, I think what's, we talk about a lot of disparate concepts, and they're all over the map, and they bring up different issues, and each one of them has different political bents and popularity, and will hit different segments in different ways. And Tom mentioned renters versus owners and the whole thing, and then we've got the university, blah, blah, blah. It'd be nice to see in the report at least some strategy or some way of, and it seems to me, rather than doing a scattershot thing and just saying, well, here's a bunch of things you could do, and these will end up with these results, what's the strategy for approaching this? And some of these are interlinked. And it would be good to have that kind of thought through. And I don't know if that's a component you're really thinking about, or if it's more just collection ideas, but I hope you're doing that. So just thought I would put that point out there.
Yeah, I was going to say, just to follow on that this whole process has been really interesting to me in terms of going from concept, big level concept, these lofty goals, but like the rental property stakeholder meeting was really informative about just bringing back the practical reality of like, how are we going to actually do this? How is it at the individual level going to get done? So to Nick's point, in the report, if there's a little bit more direction on prioritization and the cost benefit analysis and timeframes and examples like we talked about before, that all those kind of concepts came up over and over again in our discussions, and they were really really brought it home to me that this is like, this is the only way we're going to actually get it done.
Yeah, I think what we're trying to do is identify the things that we know need to happen and can happen right now, and make those a priority. Like, I feel very strongly that the electrification ordinance, even though it's not going to impact a ton of buildings, new buildings, having that in place is super important to then build off of, right? And that's something that we know is legal. We know it's not going to impact some people more than others. Like, I'm working on a all-electric 6-unit project in Oakland right now, and it's saving the developer a bunch of money. He doesn't have to run natural gas infrastructure, and he's like, now that he knows about all this stuff, he's like, oh, I'm gonna just do this all the time. It makes sense. So I think there's that kind of stuff is just like, we're trying to find the things like that are really important. They're gonna make a big difference over time, and we know we can do them now. And then there's some things like Berkeley has an RFP out now for doing a super deep dive into their building stock, figuring out what exactly needs to get done and how that's going to impact different types of people and what the solutions are, right? Like, we can't figure that out as part of this work scope. So that's something where it's like, we know these are the things that need to happen. There's going to have to be more work done to figure out how exactly that's going to happen here. And I think that's kind of like the next steps, and we can help identify some of those needs, whether it's a study or piggybacking off the other work that's being done. So we're cognizant of it, and I think we're trying to parse out those things of what can be done right now and what the next steps will be to get to carbon neutral by 2050 or 2045.
Yeah, I especially want to thank members of the public who came and contributed some like really tangible ideas. I think it was really helpful, and just what I heard more is, leverage some of the things Albany already knows how to do, and leverage things that are out there already. So like existing programs we can build off of. Albany Activity Guide, like that's a community outreach that's already set up. Put in a fun course or training event. Makes it, people already know how to do that. So I really, thanks for those ideas, and I'm glad to hear that consultants are super tuned in to that.
And so we started already shifting the conversation to transportation, but if we also want to discuss that a little bit more closely, if anyone had any specific comments to start off. I just noticed that we've definitely emphasized bikes, which I know are very big in Albany, but I also think we can talk a little bit more about pedestrians. I think we mentioned it a little bit with illumination, but talking more about safe routes in general for all active transportation. Is there anything else that people want to talk about for transportation?
Well, we kind of didn't talk about, and we talked about autonomous vehicles a little bit, but we kind of stayed away from that just because it was felt like that was a little too, we're not ready to start implementing that. But I think you mentioned, that's like one of those, that last mile kind of thing, and hopefully that keeps on developing. But we thought about it, but didn't include it really.
The one thought I have is, and I've noticed this just in being a cyclist that tries to do a lot bicycling, it is so easy to get in a car, turn a key, and just go somewhere. And part of the reason that the AC transit buses don't go, and even the small ones don't go, is they were just losing their shirts on this stuff, and they couldn't keep them running and pay a driver, drive an empty bus around because so I think there's a linkage between getting better public transportation and diminishing this freedom of just jumping in this beast and piloting it wherever you want, whenever you feel like it. So again, I stumble over this thing of how can you disincentivize? And people talk about biking. You go to Davis, everybody's biking around. You go to other places in European countries, and many more bicyclists on the road. And there could be a lot more people cycling. We have great infrastructure now. We've done a lot to try to promote that. And I think we still have a very minuscule percentage of people actually commuting by bike. I mean, they may go around for fun on bikes, but it's more the hardcore. And you shouldn't have to be hardcore to use a bike. So I think the focus on the bike, first of all, is because you can get places relatively quickly on a bike and safely. And I mean, it's like 4 or 5 times faster than walking. And it's a very useful tool, but again, it's just completely blown out of the water by the ease with which you can use a vehicle. So then I think that we want to focus on, well, that ease transfers to an electric vehicle, so we'll just promote that. But again, it's trying to get people away from just doing that. It's hard to beat it. Taking a bike is an extra hurdle, takes extra effort. You have to prepare for inclement weather. It is something it's going to be a hard habit to change. So I don't know if there's some sort of way to, that's why I like the idea of anything that, like the parking issue, and people have to pay more for that convenience. You just have to pay more. But it's not an easy thing to pull off.
Sorry, can you say something? So just about bikes, as far as getting people to bike instead of drive, I think it would be helpful to, just get more bike lanes on main thoroughfares. San Pablo right now is not very bike friendly. I don't know if we intend it to ever be, but that would be really, really helpful. Also, as far as getting people on bikes, some people just either don't have bikes or have bikes that are in very bad condition. I know my dad once asked me to get his chain to start moving again because it was like rusted in a fixed position. And I know my sister just started biking more because she actually got a bike that fits her, because I think it was Waterside Workshops, like near Aquatic Park, that had like a bike exchange or cheap bike buying thing. And so something that Albany could put on could be like a bike exchange. Like if you have a bike that doesn't fit you, bring it, and then bring other people bring their kids, and then can kind of pass it down, and maybe people could get bikes, as well as we were talking about the activity guide for Albany. Maybe if you wanted to do like a bike fixing workshop, just like a super beginner bike fixing workshop, not necessarily to make people master mechanics, but to make sure that they had bikes that were rideable.
Are there any other comments about transportation? All right, and then we'll move on to the carbon-free economy, so if anyone wants to start with that.
I'd just like to say I'd encourage use of the term green economy rather than carbon-free, because green economy is actually better defined and it's more holistic.
All right, it doesn't sound like there's much that we have to talk about with this. Okay, then I guess we'll move on to the adaptation and resilience. Anyone has comments on this as well?
I have a question. Do we know if there's anything currently in the works on the Albany or state level that would kind of improve our resilience or our green economy that we could put our kind of weight behind?
Yeah, in terms of impacts of climate change, there's been a fair amount of analysis at the state level, and also the San Francisco Bay Conservation Development Commission, BCDC, did quite a thorough asset inventory and risk assessment. The challenge now is now that we know what those risks are, is turning that into projects. And that's where the Coastal Commission is especially supporting living infrastructure, living shorelines where you use things like oyster beds and other natural solutions to prevent storm surge. So we just need to partner and to highlight what happens in Albany.
I guess my question was more like, is there any legislation right now that's trying to be passed at the city or state level that could address our issues, kind of?
There's a state bill that I just saw that's being proposed, I think, by Henry Stern, who went to Cal, actually. But basically, it's an example of, upcoming legislation, and it's proposing a lot of funding for just the things that Stephanie talked about, which is to develop greater resilience and greater emergency preparedness to some of the things that we talked about here. Wildfires are a big issue and are expected to worsen. Earthquake preparedness, also the heat wave risk to the most vulnerable is a big challenge as the climate warms, as we expect to see more intense heat. So I think that these things are coming down the pipeline and that the state is recognizing their importance, but I think it's not quite taken solid form yet, but they're definitely proposals with a lot of potential project funding and support for projects.
One thing I want to comment on is that there's a big overlap on over the emergency response, which is sort of an adaptation thing, and trying to get the information out about climate change and what to do to prevent it. So I think there's a good opportunity to take our efforts related to the community emergency response team development and sort of the neighborhood communication that goes on. People are very interested in that, and they tend to attend it and participate in it. They have a CERT training class in Albany, and a lot of people have gone through it, and they keep meeting, and it's a good way to, I think if we have our plans sort of piggyback on that as far as communications with block captains and things like that, we can also get things like electrification interest ramping up and more information out to people in the neighborhoods. So I think there's a good way to sort of at least bring those things together within Albany. That's not something we'll get any state funding on.
So I had one other comment, which is just to bring in something which I don't believe we discussed directly this evening, which is housing and the relationship between housing and emissions. So if you cannot afford to live in the Bay Area, you tend to move far, far away. And you may live in Stockton or the Central Valley somewhere. It's much less expensive. However, you have to commute, and that commute can really take a toll on you personally because it takes hours a day, or on your family life, or you may have to, drive, which is very difficult. And it can create a lot of emissions as well as a lot of congestion. So the two are linked, and this has been highlighted in a recent editorial by some members of the Assembly as well as faculty at UC Berkeley. But it's just to say that as an example, a real world example, my daughter who goes to Albany High School with Allison, actually, their math teacher, Allison, and my daughter Gabby's math teacher, she lives far, far away. I'm not even sure where, but it's probably 2 hours away, where she can actually afford a house. And so I don't know how she manages it.
She
manages it. It's really rather Yeah,
Oh, do you want to know? I happen to know how she manages.
yeah.
Okay.
So,
She has an apartment in Albany that she stays in from Monday to Friday and then goes back home to her beautiful sprawling ranch home with all her pets and beautiful views for the weekends.
right.
She's,
So, yeah, it's a lot of, I mean, it's just one person out of many. But I think the point is that we can think more about, Albany is a dense urban village, so to speak, but there are opportunities perhaps for greater accessory dwelling units. So we can ask, well, how many empty or unnecessary garages are there which are very dilapidated? That could be a housing unit. They're small, but it is potentially very convenient to live in a place like Albany, close to, say, the BART. So it's just something to, and there have been measures that have been approved statewide which streamlines the process for building these units. We just built one in my house recently. But it's just to say that, that can help. It's just part of the puzzle.
I was thinking that it might be possible to bring some of these ideas to the Social and Economic Justice Commission, and I think have them look at it and before we even go through with our final strategies, but to just give a first look and early stage.
I think that's a really interesting idea, because I know, I believe there's a program in San Francisco for school teachers that gets subsidized housing. And I think we should look at city employees and school district employees and implementing a program where we assist them, because what's overlaying a lot of these issues is that Albany is changing dramatically because of the housing costs. And if, I think we need to do something to maintain that character of the city, that it's diversity, economic diversity at least. And so I'd like to see something in the cap that addresses that for at least starting with city employees and school district employees, and then looking further at other folks that work in the city that can't afford to live here.
Okay, so I think that we can wrap up our discussion now and move on to our regular meeting agenda. And so again, we'll begin with our roll call.
Sure, just checking, does anyone need a quick break, or are you ready to power through?
Short break?
Tiny break?
It's fine with me. Take.
Stretch the legs.
So,
Yeah, that will work. It's a prompt.
It's only one of 8 to 12, like.
Yeah, well, this is 3 actually, but it's 3 of 12. I just want to show off how boring they are. Because the energy is the smallest but most incomprehensible.
moving computer problems?
Oh, I just, I always like to it just drives me crazy how some of this stuff works. But no, it just, no, I just like to drop so here I've just, and I type up my comments, right? So I just drop these in, but when I drop them in, sometimes it it does these weird things with the margins. And then you can't, it doesn't give you any ability to change the formatting or anything. So I thought, well, I'll just chop it out of there. And like here,
I didn't text you yet.
and what is this? I mean, it's just something I don't want there at all. Now I'm trying to put it back, so now I put it back in like this.
When I paste, I usually do Control-Shift-V, because then it will
Yeah,
maintain your
yeah.
original. But
Well-
I avoid copying so many times because it'll just mess up, and Google Docs is not very friendly with it.
Yeah, well, so I'll just put this stuff here, and then I can put my, it's just all I want to do is have a little place where I can type and keep track of what was going on.
If you're excited.
You guys did a great presentation there. You're with it. I don't know, I just felt, hey man, you got some good skills. You have a career in marketing.
Well, good to meet you.
I just wanted to say
I
thanks.
tell you,
Sorry, like,
I love it when you get up and,
materials didn't come.
well, okay, here we go.
It's okay, you did all the work. There's nothing for you
It's all
to
good
apologize.
experience.
I didn't do anything
Awesome.
except have dinner with you.
Remember when I went to college, I got into
Oh, yeah. Like I said, you did everything. Thank you for doing it.
and you stick your boards up, and they were just ruthless. I remember my first class I went to where there were presentations and crits. We had as our instructor was this guy, John Piastier, who was the architectural critic for the LA Times. And he came up, and he was this guy, he looked like he was like John Saturday Night or whatever. And it was the disco era, so he was really full of himself. And if you got up there and still around, he just was insulting. Sulky, screaming, people would go out of the room. It was terrible. Remember one time there was a lecture, we had a visiting lecture, and the guy came and he gave his talk.
People didn't even see those.
So the next class we had, Pastier goes out on there's a little desk, brings his folding chair, he sits down and he sits there and goes, okay, you guys are absolute assholes to my guest speaker last time, so we're going to sit here for the whole hour. And if anyone leaves the class, I'm going to fail. And he just sat there looking for an hour.
Get that.
Oh boy, wouldn't fly at this time.
Saw like once before.
You guys were smooth.
That was an amazing presentation. Thank you.
It looked like it. I don't know.
Thank you for putting all that time into that.
Have you been going to the ACAC meetings?
No. I missed the last one, I think I was out of town.
Why you guys
Doing a
belong.
lot more
Are we
traveling.
gonna,
So,
For a job?
yeah. Comes and goes. But no, I mean, and Jessica's in Australia
Max said there's a very
for work.
meaty
She
issue.
got like a 6-month appointment.
Very
to go down
meaty
there.
issue.
I don't know exactly what she's doing, but so she, we had a really good meeting about 2 or 3 months ago that we started getting some action items, really tangible things going.
Oh, that's a great idea.
And she was kind of like, okay, so somebody's going to need to carry this forward.
The high school was talking about
And so far it's
forum was what we're
raising
really
that
making our
group's
presentation. But
activity level's been a little difficult.
be interesting.
I mean,
Yeah,
that core
we're gonna
group
talk about
most of
sustainability, but it's all
most of the core group is on this sustainability committee, and we can only get 3 of us there at a time, so it's been a little limited.
May I?
Yes, thank you.
You can eat them.
I know Irene is very
eat 'em.
musically attuned. Yeah.
But that in combination with the Albany, the Carbon Free Albany website, we should get going on that again.
All right, you want to call the meeting to order?
Yes.
I'll do the roll call. Committee Member Cooper?
Here.
Committee Member Larson?
Here.
Committee Member Martin?
Here.
Committee Member Peterson?
Here.
Vice Chair Sear?
Here.
Committee Member Way?
Here.
And Chair Smithies?
Here. And so now moving on to the approval of the minutes from the March 20th meeting. Were there any edits to those? Has everyone had the chance to look through them? So I think we can go ahead and approve as, yes. So then a motion to approve the minutes from the March 20th meeting.
I move to approve the minutes.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Any opposed? Great. And so then moving on to public comment. And so here's another opportunity if you'd like to address anything that isn't on our agenda for today. All right, yeah. Public comment that's not on the agenda. Yes, please. Yes, you can go ahead.
I'm sorry, do I just say what I would like to, or I elaborate already? No.
You can really just go ahead and
I'll
say
go ahead, okay. I would like to, as we heard from the consultants who left already, that even they have trouble getting data. And obviously, this is something I bring up because I am looking into data, and I know from the committee members that this is an issue. And right now, the Climate Action Plan is very much guidelines on, what kind of actions the city would like to take. But at one point, and also I know a lot of comments from the committee have been like, but is that really effective? How much is that going to save? So at one point, in a few years at least, the committee will need to be tracking, having data on what is happening in the city. And as it looks like right now, this is not data that is easily found from PG&E or even from consultants. So I strongly would encourage the committee to look into, in the near future, how you could obtain data directly from your citizens. Looking into if you can make like a smaller company or a smaller app that could be on the list that the PG&E, so PG&E has this button that you can give your data to a third party, and that is from a list of companies and apps and so on. And if the city of Albany could create something that could go on that list, you could just encourage your citizens, it's one click, to kind of provide their data without personal information. So somehow you have the data, because this will be an issue in the future with all these privacy laws that are coming more and more. So that's just a point I would really like to encourage the committee to focus on for the future. Thank you.
Thank you. And are there any other members of the public who would like to comment on something that's not on the agenda today? All right. And so then we'll move on to 4 announcements, starting with the sustainability events.
Yeah. Oops. I guess that my mic is on. It's Earth Month. Our Earth Day celebration is this Saturday at the waterfront. We have there are many beach cleanups throughout the year that we promote, and our Earth Day one is we do annually. Come check out our new beach. East Bay Regional Park District opened the beach. I think it was in December, so you can come help us clean it. There's a compost giveaway and Friends of Albany Park's cleanup event on May 4th. Is that right? You can get how many bags of compost? 2. Get 2 bags of compost.
Where is that?
At Memorial Park. So it's a Friends of our Albany Park cleanup at Memorial Park. It's where we've been doing the compost giveaway on Carmel by the redwood trees for the past probably 4 or 5 years. The citywide garage sale is May 11th. If you want to host a garage sale, you missed the deadline a couple hours ago, but we might still take your application if you want it, if you really want to host a garage sale. Do you know how many we have? How many garage sales we'll have? 70.
It's 70.
Wow, that happened quickly.
Nancy was busy.
Yeah. So there'll be 70 garage sales on May 11th, which is a Saturday. And then in May, we have a couple bike events that our rec department's putting on. There's a Bike About Town event on May 17th and a Bike In Movie Night on May 24th. I didn't look at what the movie was, so you'll have to be surprised. Those are our sustainability events for now. There's also a Bike to Work Day coming up. I want to say it's, do you know what the day is? The 9th is what I was going to say. Okay. May 9th. Yeah.
What time is the cleanup and compost giveaway at the park?
9 to 12.
Thank you.
9 to 12.
That's it.
And then we can move on to 4.2, which is the Carbon-Free Albany update.
Perfect. And speaking of Earth Day, at the Watershed Project beach cleanup on April 20th, we have an opportunity to table for Carbon-Free Albany to pass out flyers and stickers. And then if anyone is willing to bring their laptop and use their own personal hotspot, we can get people to sign up. I can't make it because I have another event going on that day, but I'm wondering if any of the members from the CAC are interested in tabling at that event and getting the word out about Carbon-Free Albany.
That's this Saturday?
On April 20th,
Saturday.
yeah, this Saturday, from 9 to 12.
I can't.
Maybe.
You can get back to me too if you have to look at your calendar, or if you know of anyone who I could get in touch with who would be willing to spread the word. If not, we'll just have flyers available for people to pick up. We just won't have any representatives there.
I can do that. And I'll have practiced at the senior center
Yeah, perfect.
event, so.
Great.
Give it a shot.
Thank you, Nick. That's another update. Nick will be tabling at the senior center.
We have a table.
Resource.
I might just be standing.
No, you have a table. You should have a table.
Oh, okay.
We signed up for one.
Oh, okay.
Tomorrow at the Senior Center Resource Expo. So hopefully we get a lot of signups from that. Thank you, Nick. As for other updates for Carbon-Free Albany, the site upgrades on the Community Climate Solutions end, which is now Community Climate Net or something. They're working on a name change, but that Community Climate Solutions platform, they've done all their back-end modifications to the platform. So if any of you have visited Carbon-Free Albany recently, you'll have noticed that it looks a little bit different. I think it's a lot more user-friendly, which is great. Apparently the onboarding process is supposed to be a lot easier, and I know when we first had people sign up for the platform, I got a lot of emails every morning, people being confused and not understanding what they were doing. So hopefully that should be easier, which can help us with signups. And then also, I think the biggest change is to the actions. If it'll load, she tried to model signing up for actions. It's supposed to look similar to Netflix, where you can add a plus or add to your list, basically. Click on the plus sign so that you can come back and do it later. And then it's also supposed to mimic Yelp so that you can see how many $signs it is, what your time commitment is, and then how much gas you're saving, and then your total annual savings, along with more simplified instructions rather than just that one long page. So I think with these updates, hopefully with some more outreach, we can increase our numbers past
What number,
25.
what are we at now?
We're at 36
Okay.
as of Sunday. It went up from 35 to 36 last week.
Yay.
Now we need to,
We're gonna do the present, are you gonna do the presentation to the high school?
I can talk about that, but do you know if it's possible to sign up on phones now?
That I don't know, actually. I thought that was the goal, but I have not tried. So
see one letter at a time.
I'm trying to find the homepage, but for some reason the logo is not taking me there. But yes, so this is now the onboarding process. When you go through it, it'll give you an actual like carbon footprint. No, I don't think it is. So hopefully it's a lot more user-friendly and people will like it more.
And so then moving on to 4.3 EBCE update.
Oh, that's me. So we got an update from EBCE yesterday. Here, let me grab this. I'll just show you our opt-out rates real quickly. Which one is it? This one. So this is current EBCE enrollment. Our opt-out rate is still on the lower side for the county, and our renewable 100 opt-up rate is now the highest if you don't count Piedmont, because Piedmont, which I'm not counting Piedmont, because they defaulted their customers into renewable 100, so that's why they don't count. So we're pretty happy with the numbers. We could still do more to push renewable 100, and we can talk about that with the outreach subcommittee, but it's slowly inching up. Some other communities have had real trouble with their opt-out rates because of the misinformation about the bills over the winter. So Livermore's opt-up rate is quite high now. But EBCE staff are actually working with commercial customers who opted out because it's been almost a year and they can opt back in for free after a year. So they're going to start doing some outreach to some large commercial customers. We have one large commercial customer that told me specifically that they opted out. But EBCE is not supposed to give us that information. So they're going to work with them. And hopefully we'll see some improvement. Some of their programs are rolling out now, so they will be more attractive to commercial customers. They're looking at some peak demand kind of programs, and solar and storage, and some of these things might be very attractive to our large commercial customers. So hopefully. Other updates, they are, for their local development business plan, the most exciting thing they're working on at the moment that's relevant to us is they have hired a consulting firm, an engineering firm, to do an analysis for a variety of electrification reach codes. And Jeff's presentation later will kind of give details on what that means, but they have, I think I sent you an email, they have a meeting, their first community meeting is next Wednesday, April 24th at the City of Berkeley. It's 1947 Center Street, in their multipurpose room, and that's actually being hosted by the Berkeley Energy Commission. We're still working out exactly what the agenda will look like, and whether it's just a traditional public comment period or more of a workshop style. I'm pushing for more of a workshop style, but it's for cities of Oakland, Emeryville, Berkeley, and Albany. But again, really, it's an EBCE initiative. So they're looking for stakeholder input early on in their process of analysis. But at the same time, the City of Berkeley's city council members, they have a city council member initiative to look at all electric building. So there's a lot of things happening at once, I guess, at the meeting is what I'm saying. But we definitely encourage you to go to that meeting as well. The other thing we talked about yesterday with EBCE that was really interesting is we had a long conversation about data, and there's a couple things that might be good news for us, but we're still in a wait-and-see mode. They're trying to see if they can get natural gas data, which kind of surprised me. So they're going to be easier to work with than PG&E to get electricity data. But MCE, because they operate energy efficiency programs, actually has access to gas data, even though they're not even though they don't supply gas. So EBCE and there's another CCA that are have put in an application to the CPUC to see if they can actually access that data. That would be very helpful for us. The other thing is they're not strictly bound to the CPUC 1515 rule the same way that investor-owned utilities are, but they still want to abide by it. But they are reaching out to large commercial customers that basically make it so that our commercial data is dropped, and they're going to see if they can get the okay from them to provide that aggregated data to us. And if they get the okay, then we can actually get that data in the future. So that's really great. We can rely on them for that outreach. So again, we'll wait and see, but data may be coming to us finally.
Are they talking about building any utility scale installations in the county?
Yeah, so right now for the local development business plan, they're starting with government buildings, particularly municipal buildings, but they'll include school districts, et cetera. And they're talking about doing solar and storage projects at critical facilities. So that's the first project that's rolling out. And so we're working on getting them a list of our critical facilities in the hopes that we can make sure that those are, there's this resiliency component to having the solar plus storage projects, but also it just makes sense to start there. But they are talking about large scale in-county projects as well, but I haven't heard about any of those actually moving forward. They do have some contracts. I think they had some bids earlier this winter to, but a lot of those large scale projects will probably end up being in the Eastern County area, not in Albany.
Yeah. One thing I think this chart really shows is that we were correct in defaulting to the Brilliant, because if you look at the other large ones under Bright, they have a worse opt-out rate, and opting up to Brilliant is low. So there was a real missed opportunity there with all those other cities.
Yeah, and a lot of the cities are actually talking about maybe trying to default people now, but I think it's much more complicated to do that now. So
it'll trigger a lot more opting out. Yeah.
All right, thank you. And now moving on to presentation. So 5.1 presentation on building construction regulations.
Bear with us here a second. So in the interest of time, I'll go through this relatively quickly. And of course, if you have questions or want more details, I'd be happy to respond to your questions. This is basically some background. There's been lots of discussion, both locally and nationally, about eliminating natural gas from buildings, particularly new buildings. And I thought it would be helpful for the committee and members of the public to have a little bit of context. This is kind of a bureaucratic presentation, I'm afraid. But that's kind of the realm that we work in. I want to start by, first acknowledging that we need to get natural gas out of buildings. I want to make it clear that I think it's a really good idea. And I also think there are some things that are going to make it a challenge bureaucratically, and that's a little bit of what my presentation is about. First of all, what I'd like to do is give you a quick overview of what we do now as a baseline, and then the process of changing what we do and how different ways of changing regulations related to getting natural gas out of buildings. Today on our books, there are basically 3 sets of regulations that affect how things are built. And all this is in the context, primarily in the context of natural gas. There, in other types of utilities or other types of construction, there might be other contexts and other details. But again, primarily focusing on the natural gas context. First of all, there's our planning and zoning code. Second is the building code, which both of those are in our municipal code, as is the third, which is regulations regarding work that's done within the public property. Those code references, the chapters relate to our municipal code. I'll go through each one of these real quickly, just one slide each. The planning and zoning regulations really tend to look at the size and scale and placement of buildings and the types of uses in those buildings. It is a process that would be, the timing of the planning process, it would be the right time to talk about whether or not there's natural gas in a building. But planning regulations per se have historically not been the place where you talk about the details of building systems. And the regulatory framework for planning really doesn't get into that level of detail. In addition, some planning applications are quasi-judicial, which means there's discretion and conditions of approval can be placed on projects. Others are ministerial, which means they basically happen over the counter. There aren't public notices, and they go relatively quickly and inexpensively. And I should also point out that the world of planning is changing dramatically. In your earlier conversations on other agenda items, it was pointed out. State laws are changing the game in extraordinary ways. And particularly with respect to housing development, more and more housing development projects, I think, in the coming years are going to be not go through the discretionary process that we've grown accustomed to in California. The second is the California Building Code. This is a collection of code books. I brought props just to kind of give you an idea. These are 3 of 12 binders that constitute the California Building Standards Code. And I'm going to spend a moment on this terminology because it gets confusing and people use it sometimes the wrong way. There's a whole suite of binders like this. That collection is called the California Building Standards Code. Within those codes, there's something called the California Building Code. And then you can see the list there. A couple of these I just want to point out, again, related with respect to natural gas. The California Building Code applies to most new buildings or construction in any building, really, for that matter, existing buildings, except 1 and 2 story and, 1 and 2 unit residential structures, which use the California Residential Code. And basically, the residential code is a simplified building code. So instead of having to look at 1,000 pages worth of codes to figure out how to build something, you have to look at 500 or 300 or something like that. So it's a little bit of a blessing. The other codes go into the very specific details. Natural gas itself really only shows up in the plumbing code, and they're pretty deep into the plumbing code. Cal Green is worth mentioning, and Energy Code is worth mentioning. I'll go into those in a little bit more detail in a minute. One other terminology thing that comes up a lot that gets, and people who are in the business know this, but they still use the wrong terminology. Sometimes people call the California Energy Code Title 24. And what Title 24 refers to is the section of the California Code of Regulations. And every state agency has regulations, and they all show up in a bunch of different, these different titles. Building codes, the whole entire building code is Title 24. Sometimes you'll hear somebody say, well, they have to do Title 24 calculations or Title 24 energy calculations. What they're really referring to is the energy code, which is just a small part of Title 24. Not a big deal, really, but it does get confusing sometimes if people don't use the right terminology. With respect to work on the public right-of-way on public property, we do issue encroachment permits to utility companies, but it's only for very narrow function. It's basically to ensure that they have traffic controls. So if PG&E is coming in to work on a natural gas line or a utility pole or East Bay Mud or whatever, our permitting is really limited to making sure that there's traffic controls and making sure that they're replacing the streets and sidewalks or whatever to our standards. We don't approve the construction of a natural gas line in the city. We don't inspect it. They can do it wherever they want. They do have to get this permit from us just for those, as I mentioned, but we don't tell them where to put their natural gas lines or whether or not they can put a natural gas line, as it stands today at least. The California Building Standards Code, all those binders really start from the building side of the meter. So PG&E comes in, puts the gas line in, puts the gas meter in. We check the gas lines in the building, and if the integrity of the gas lines in the building are good, then PG&E comes back and makes the connection and powers it up, or pressures up the gas line. And that leaves the primary regulatory agency for PG&E on natural gas is the California Public Utilities Commission. So I want to spend a minute on the building code, because that's often a place where people talk about, well, we need to modify the building code in order to regulate the application of natural gas in buildings. First of all, we're obligated to enforce the California Building Standards Code, most of it at least. There are some areas that we don't get involved with. For the most part, it's other government facilities. Hospitals is another area where cities don't review or inspect hospitals. And then there are a few weird things that just, I don't know why they are, but for example, we don't look at elevators. We'll do the rest of the building, but you got to call the state inspector to come and look at the elevator. I don't know why. These codes are updated on a regular basis every 3 years, and there's a lot going on at different levels of the preparation of codes. So the life of a code begins with nonprofit organizations. There's a couple listed there. The main one is the ICC, which is called the International Code Council. They prepare what they call a model code, which is, I would say probably 95% of the model code ends up in the California codes. They also provide certification and training for us. And right now, or later this year, ICC is holding elections on, members can vote on modifications to the next round of building code updates that will hit California in a few years. And there's been a lot of discussion in the environmental community about making sure that natural gas is taken into consideration in the upcoming codes. So although that's not directly related to the California codes, it's very important. It serves as the foundation to a lot of what we do. At the state level, there's a state agency, the California Building Standards Commission, that oversees all this. A bunch of different state agencies take the model codes, make some changes, give it to the commission approves it, and 6 months later, it becomes a mandate on the city. A few agencies prepare codes that are exclusive to California, and that's in particular the Energy Code and the Cal Green Code. And those are completely developed by, almost completely developed by California state agencies. As I mentioned, the codes are updated every 3 years. The next update is going to become effective on January 2020. And this is a mandate on us whether or not we formally adopt it. Cities typically do adopt the codes. We typically, in the past, have made relatively minor administrative amendments to the code just to make it fit into our organizational structure and making sure the names of staff people and departments line up with how we're organized. And the fire department also makes some changes. Their code modification process is a little bit different, but it all occurs at the same time. Normally, we would start to work on this when we get the code books themselves, which haven't been published yet. They're usually approved by the state in June, and they're printed by the International Code Council in late summer. And then there are usually a flurry of seminars and webinars and so forth in early fall. So everybody gets up to speed on the new codes, and then we'll go to the city council in the November, December timeframe for approval of the amendments. I want to touch base, as I mentioned, about a couple of things that throw a little bit of a wrench into how amendments could be made. The first is the California Energy Code. It's an innovative code. It was first adopted in the 70s and has been very effective in improving the energy efficiency of buildings, but it's complicated, and this is a very simplified description of it. And I should have started this presentation by acknowledging I'm not a particular code expert. I understand how to administer them, but the details of this are really people who do this on a day-to-day basis every day, 40 hours a week really could, if we needed to, we could bring someone in who works with this stuff every day to help explain the details of how these codes work. But basically, the energy code gives you two options. You either you take what they call a prescriptive option, which is here's a type of window or here's a type of equipment that if you use this, you automatically get approval, or you do a performance option, which means you have a little bit more flexibility, but you have to do some calculations to show that you're meeting the requirements. So, for example, sometimes people want to put a special kind of window in their house that is less energy efficient, and you compensate for that by putting in more insulation, and you get to the same energy performance. With respect to KALB, the KALB is a newer code, as it says on the slide, first adopted in 2008. It has a lot of good green building principles embedded in it. It doesn't, however, address energy efficiency. It defers to the California Energy Code on energy efficiency. So, and as you may recall, we had a presentation a few months ago from Wes. I'm forgetting Wes's last name now. I'm sorry. Solons, who was with Stop Waste and is now with USG. I was going to say LEED, U.S. Green Building Council. So there are tiers for improving green building elements and higher, more challenging tiers that the city could adopt, but that's not going to address energy efficiency or natural gas. To make amendments to our building codes, it depends on which code you're touching. The energy code is the most stringent and most difficult to modify. We're basically required, if we wanted to modify the energy code, we have to prepare a feasibility or have a consultant prepare a feasibility study, and that feasibility study is reviewed by the California Energy Commission to ensure that our changes are cost effective. To my knowledge, while there may be some cities who are working on that now, I don't know of anybody who has successfully completed a feasibility study that says you don't need to have that authorizing the elimination of natural gas in new buildings. Hopefully there will be a city that can figure that out in our climate zone, and then that will really open up some opportunities for other cities. With respect to other elements of the California Building Standards Code, there's a little bit more flexibility. We still have to make findings. First of all, we can only make amendments that are more restrictive than state regulations, and we have to make findings that these amendments are necessary due to local conditions. Unlike the Energy Code amendments, no one approves those findings, but if somebody were to legally challenge the city's decision, we would have to defend ourselves in court. Then, as I mentioned, Cal Green, there are optional tiers that we could adopt there. With respect to timing of these things, we can do it at any time in the code cycle. Obviously, it's more efficient to do it at the beginning because you get more time for that amendment to be effective. They're basically each code cycle needs a new amendment every 3 years, so it would be better to do it now rather than 2 or 3 years from now, but it doesn't have to be exactly by January 1st. And I'm sorry to go on, I'm going to wrap this up, but I think this is really the key thing where, as we're talking about how to do this, it could be controversial. Oops. She's jumping ahead. She wants me to get to the end. There are two things that if someone were unhappy with the actions the city were taking to remove natural gas from buildings, that there are legal arguments that could be made. The first is a basic legal doctrine that if the state or federal government, the term used, legal term used, occupies the field of a regulatory area, the city is supposed to stay out of it. So, for example, the federal government administers energy efficiency appliances. So we can't come up with our own energy efficiency standards. An analogy would be automobiles. We can't come up with our own standards for how energy efficient automobiles in Albany can be. The second legal issue is whether or not climate change is a statewide concern or a municipal affair. I think legitimate arguments can be made both ways, and we would certainly hear someone, I think we could prepare findings that say this is a municipal affair because of the impacts on the city. We could also, I'm sure, hear people talk about how that really should be something that is a national or obviously an international issue as well. So those are our legal tests that we would have to consider carefully. So I want to leave this with kind of a little bit brief discussion on what's proposed in Berkeley and an overview of different ways to address the approach to eliminating natural gas. What the city of Berkeley is doing, and this is essentially a one-sentence ordinance. It's many pages, but when you drill right down into it, they're basically saying no new building permits can be issued for new buildings that have a natural gas connection. And whether or not their findings can overcome those potential legal challenges, we'll have to see. I think it's going to be really interesting to hear the meeting next week and some of the legal analysis that I'm sure that's going on behind the scenes in Berkeley on how to make this a defensible ordinance. Other ways to doing this, ideally in my mind, what would happen is either the people who prepare the model codes nationally or internationally and/or our state legislature would amend state laws to give either mandate it statewide, which would be the best, or at least give us clearly the authority to make local amendments in this area so that we could go ahead and do that. And either the state legislature could do that or perhaps some of the state agencies themselves could take the initiative to do it. We could take a shot at doing it locally. We would have to defend that, and or we could wait and see how successful the city of Berkeley's approach is. I'd love it to be as simple as what the city of Berkeley is trying to do. That would be, if I had to pick any of these, the first would be the state legislature just do it, and the second would be a very clean, simple line in the sand that says, no, we're not doing it, and just keep out of the complexity of amending building codes and dealing with the Energy Commission and so on and so forth. So again, sorry for racing through this, but I thought this was important information to have, and if you want more questions or you want me to come back in another meeting, we can continue this.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And now we'll have an opportunity for public comment, and so again, we'll be sticking with the 3 minutes per speaker, please.
Preston Jordan, again, speaking on behalf of Albany Climate Action Coalition this time. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. I personally have been on the very lower part of the learning curve over the last few months. And yeah, all those terminology problems I've run into, Title 24 Energy Code, had the chief building inspector for Berkeley grumbling that people were referring to it as the building code, but it's the energy code, and I didn't know what he was talking about. And so thank you for clarifying that. Albany Climate Action Coalition has networked with a group of environmental organizations, the Natural Resources Defense, NRDC, and the Sierra Club on this issue, and they're working with a number of cities. And so there's these two different models of ways to go. One is the Berkeley adopt this single line ordinance in the municipal code. The other is amending the energy code. The preference of the network partners is amending the energy code through, I guess, what's sometimes called a REACH code. And the reason for that is because that will put it in front of the California Energy Commission, and they believe that that will help to bend the curve down the line with the statewide code update that happens in 3 years. So it's sort of this trade-off of, we can get it done quickly, maybe cleanly through a local ordinance, but that won't have as much leverage or impact statewide. Albany Climate Action Coalition thinks it's more important to have the statewide impact. Sort of the unofficial motto is what's good for Albany is good for the state. What's good for California is good for Ohio. So this would be a way of California, of Albany joining these other cities and leading California. In terms of justifying a local REACH court, it's very interesting to know sort of what the jurisdictional issues are. I would suggest that a much better basis for a local jurisdiction to adopt a REACH code is not reducing greenhouse pollution, but rather reducing the risk of fire after an earthquake and reducing indoor air pollution. So there are studies out of Lawrence Berkeley National Lab that indoor air pollution from natural gas combusting appliances is actually much worse than the standards that are put in place for outdoor air quality. So you can have air quality in your house, it's much worse than what is allowed outside. And so those two bases, I think, are much stronger because they go directly to the city's interest in maintaining public safety and public health. So I would think that those would be much less legally open to attack. I did notice that on the CalGreen code that it talked about, or it had something about EV charging. So I would think you'd look into that in terms of what's tier 1 and tier 2, and that's an interest. And then finally, hopefully some of you are going to the workshop next week. It would be, I guess I would encourage staff to, if possible, and probably wouldn't be possible, to have as a part of that workshop, since all 4 cities are getting together, an item to talk about the 4 cities joining together to restructure the utility user taxes, because I haven't heard of a meeting before where all 4 cities are potentially have staff or representatives present. So thank you very much, and I hope you'll make this a goal for the city to adopt by 2020.
Thank you. Are there any other members of the public who would like to comment on this? All right, so now we'll open it up to committee discussion.
So I understood what Preston was saying a little bit, but can you talk a bit about stretch or reach codes? Like if the city does a reach code, and like we've talked about this before for making, people do more sustainable type construction in Albany than they would have to otherwise. Does that require all this rigmarole of going?
That is kind of a terminology problem. I'm not sure. The phrase reach code doesn't actually show up in any of these code books. I think what people normally hear the phrase reach code, what you're talking about are in the CalGreen code, there's voluntary additional tiers they call tier 1 and tier 2. And that sometimes, more than anything else, is sometimes called a reach code. The other area where some cities are adopting amendments to the energy code are to relate to mandating PV on buildings, which right now isn't required. I think it will be in the new code. I haven't seen it yet, but some cities are requiring that, and they've been able to demonstrate that PV panels are cost effective. That doesn't address the natural gas issue, but that's sometimes referred to as a reach code. The cities have adopted a reach code, and that's an amendment to the energy code. I'm sorry, I'm not clearly answering your question, but it's one of those terminology problems with this stuff.
Yeah, I could comment on that. It's a policy typology. A reach code is meaning you're going faster, further than some existing mandate. So it's used in a variety of occasions, and this could be one of them.
Yeah, but in speaking with EBCE staff, they differentiated that a REACH code would be going beyond the current requirements in the building code, but that this conversation about eliminating natural gas actually is not a REACH code. I don't know the details, and perhaps that's going to be a conversation next Wednesday too, but they did differentiate between this conversation and other traditional REACH codes.
Jeff, when we were reviewing the Sprouts and senior living developments, we were limited by city building ordinances that allowed them to use LEED and different LEED rating systems. Is that something that can be changed?
Yes.
Without, because there's no state requirement in the CBC requiring LEED. That's a city requirement. So the city building code could be updated for certain things like that, correct?
No, not unless we go through this process. So what we did in that case, and is that at that time, our planning, and it's still on the books, is to get planning approval, you had to submit a preliminary calculation that you were going to meet LEED Gold standards. So that was part of the city's planning process. It wasn't part of the building code process. I don't know if LEED came up with a standard that said, and maybe they will, that says there will be no natural gas. In order to get a certain type of LEED certification, you can't have natural gas. That might be a workaround around all this. I don't know of any, maybe others do. I don't know if there are rating agencies that are going there yet.
But I think we discussed this at the time. We could amend the planning requirements so that certain points were requirements rather than optional, correct?
Right.
And that could influence these kinds of things as well.
Right.
Okay.
So what, like I'm trying to think, like in our fire department doesn't like one type of smoke detector and mandates that you have to use a different kind. And how is that? Did they have to go through something? They had to take that all the way up to the state and get approval to do that?
They went through a building code amendment process, and they made the findings of local conditions and filed that with the state. The state didn't, because that was an amendment to the fire code. The state, no one at the state approves it. You just send it in, and it's filed. And unless someone challenges it, in that particular case, some of the manufacturers of the smoke detectors that we were not going to allow were very concerned about it. They ended up not filing a legal challenge, but they certainly opposed it. But then they realized that they could make more money by selling them, and they kind of...
So basically, they did the paperwork, filed it, and then that was good enough. I mean, how long was that process?
It's a city ordinance, so it takes 60 days usually, 90 days, depending on what else we have going on.
So if we made an ordinance that didn't allow to put in flammable or fossil-based fuel lines in a building in Albany, we deem it unsafe. Is that something we would go through the same process?
It depends which code. If you're going to modify the energy code, which would...
No, I'm not modifying the energy code. I'm just saying I don't want gas in our buildings.
So...
it has nothing to do with energy.
Then you would have, the city council would have to make findings, and you'd essentially be modifying the plumbing code. And I would guess, because otherwise it's, natural gas is not addressed.
Well, I wouldn't modify the plumbing code to say take all gas pipe. I'm just saying it doesn't apply to us anymore because we won't have it. We're not going to have gas piped into.
Well, that's what the city of Berkeley is doing. But it would be better not to try to make findings. It'd be better to do it out. I think it's better to do it outside of the framework of the California Building Standards Code. And just,
no, I agree. So I don't think we need to get into the detail of where it is in the plumbing code and all this. And we're saying, I mean, if we just say we deem this hazardous, we don't want it used in our buildings anymore. How would we justify it? I mean, do we need? So then, I mean, city council isn't going to do the work, right? They're going to tell you to pursue this. Is that right? They'll task staff. I mean, the reason I'm bringing this all up is that when I last went to the city council, the mayor told me to come back with some direction from the Climate Action Committee about this specific ordinance or what we could do about eliminating gas from new construction. So what I want to do is come up with something that should we get a subcommittee together to look into this, or what's your recommendation on that?
Well, for this evening, this is just kind of information. I would say that if you want to continue the conversation and form a subcommittee to go into it in more detail, or keep it at the committee level, and we'll just continue to have this on the agenda. I don't think you can just kind of unilaterally do this without thinking through the legal considerations very carefully. I think it's not an insignificant decision.
Yeah, well, I
It's a
wasn't
really
saying
important
this.
one, but it's not insignificant.
So the goal is to try to get this in place by the rolling out the new code.
You don't need to do that.
Why wouldn't we need to do that?
You can do it, if you're doing it,
It's municipal.
you can do it anytime. You can do a municipal code change anytime you want.
Yeah, but I think as far as to the client base and the people who are coming, it makes sense to tie it with an update of the code. So it becomes folded in with the whole, for them, it hits them one time rather than doing one thing, and then later they get hit with another thing. The other issue is if we just let this drag on and on, my familiarity with mulling things over, so it'll be mulled over for years. Meanwhile, these places will be built, piped up to gas, and it won't happen. So I'm trying to think of I guess I'm asking for suggestions of how to phrase this. It sounds like the Berkeley way is actually the fastest way to do this. And then the risk on that, what you're saying, is going to be the legal ramifications.
Whether we have the legal authority to do that, yeah.
It sounds like it may be prudent for us to see what happens with Berkeley, and if they survive the legal challenge, then that would clear the way for us doing it, right?
I think we should at least wait for a week to see what they talk about next week. Yeah, I don't think, I always like to learn from the experiences of other cities. I don't want to wait by any means, but I don't think there's any magic about January 1st. You can do it before then or after then. I don't think that's going to make an impact on anything. There aren't going to be a flurry of applications that come in on January 2nd for new buildings.
No, I was just thinking, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, since we're kind of out of time here, but this is really important, and I don't want us to lose momentum. So I want us to focus on how do we make this happen, given the urgency. We could wait to hear what happened. We could learn more from next week's meeting with EBCE. Can we put this on the agenda? Which would that give us time before the next council meeting that we could make a recommendation to council on which strategy to choose? Because we have heard that the approach of trying to leverage state action is really valuable with strength in numbers.
I think putting this kind of a next steps, part 2 to this presentation on your next agenda would be the thing to do given the time. We could go on for a lot of back and forth here, and I could lay out the options for the committee and further discuss it with the benefit of having the discussion next week and informing that.
So then, given that, do we want to go ahead and designate workshop attendees and then decide whether or not it would make sense to also form a subcommittee?
And I think, Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, but since it's a public meeting, it may be okay if you have a quorum, but you may want to at least decide on a message. If anyone's going to speak specifically as a Climate Action Committee member, you may want to come up with a message as a group.
You mean a message at this upcoming meeting that's happening?
I'm just saying if you're going to speak for the committee as a whole, then the committee needs to decide on what that message might be. But if you want to speak just for yourself individually, then you don't have to do that.
Speak individually. I would suggest we just speak individually because we don't have the time to do that before next week. So it sounds like it's a opportunity to learn about what's going on. and then come back at a future meeting and discuss our next steps.
Is there a concern if there's more than a quorum of us there?
You can attend, if it's a public meeting, you all can attend, but if more than a quorum of you have a discussion about it, the subject matter at that meeting, you've violated the Brown Act.
Yeah, okay.
So talk about other stuff.
So then I guess we're just going to go as individuals and not worry about overall messaging. And then given that, we can move on to our last agenda item, which is 6.1, approval of the 2019 through 2021 work plan. And so we'll look through that and then also designate representatives to present to council.
So I've just zoomed in here on the policy review and initiatives. You spoke about this a couple months ago. We made some changes based on your recommendations at that meeting. And this is the work plan as it stands.
What I don't see in the initiatives is any kind of promotion beyond the cap. I mean, you know, in terms of community outreach and engagement and that kind of thing.
So I guess the way I read that, the last half of the first sentence says, and determine committee role in plan implementation. So that gives, it seems like that gives us discretion on how we implement the plan, including promotion, I would think. You'd like to see it stronger?
Yeah.
More explicit?
Right. I mean, I think what we want is the city to take an active role in changing behavior of residents. That's part of the cap. And so if we're all reading that the implementation is broad enough that includes that, outreach or education or whatever, however we're promoting it.
I kind of agree with what Tom's saying, that all of these seem very kind of numbed down in that, you know, determine committee role and plan, well, we've determined the role, then what do you do? You know, I mean, we want to, I think what we want to make sure is we say that the committee will then advise the city council on action to be taken. And I think, you know, sort of the word action is kind of missing out of all of this. It's a very passive role of just sort of looking over, and I'd like to see something. The other thing I get a little worried about is that we're just bound to waiting for the climate action plan to come out and before we can really do anything. And I think it's important that we can concurrently make recommendations to City Council on action that should be taken for whatever reason we think there's an urgency to do that. So that's the other thing that's missing from this, is any urgency. So even in a preamble of what we're about, there's just nothing about the urgency of climate change and what climate action is about. So if we could get that back in there, I'd love it.
Yeah, I don't remember the last time we discussed it, so it may have been a while back, but I agree with you, Nick. I think some language to the effect of supporting policies to phase natural gas out in the near term would be appropriate, as we've discussed today in the study session. We could say things like, for example, supporting all electric new homes by 2020, or the UUT revenue measure. The second thing which seems to be missing is really any specific mention of transportation. And so as I mentioned, that's the largest component. I don't really see it here. So I think we do need some points here on transportation, for example, exploration of a permit policy. So I think that's a big Because if we don't have that, I'm not sure how we're really taking strong climate action.
Yeah, I'd echo those points about wanting to see something that, and I understand, we're an advisory body, we don't implement, but we can put there that recommend near-term actions to city council to address climate change. That would be a way of wording it, such as restricting natural gas usage, implementing a utility users tax.
Yeah, I liked what you said at the very beginning of that, because it feels like as soon as we get into too much detail, then it becomes like, that's not the purpose of this thing. It's we want to keep it high enough level, but action, I get your point, that we want to keep in some action-oriented language there, so we make sure that we get that implementation. So the first part of what you said was great. I'm not sure why we need to put in examples, specifically like natural gas or whatever, but.
Right. I just want to see it so that we're not only, a big effort now is getting the climate action plan together, so that's awesome, but that we also, in our work plan, is that we advise council on other near-term actions. And I would just add, also, I like that we have specific efforts that we're undertaking, this year and next, but I really would like to see the name restored to Sustainability Committee, because otherwise, we're cutting out important components of what this advisory body can do.
Amen.
Well, so in the past, we have put very specific, and we had the BETO up there, we had other things that we're telling the city council, here's what we're working on, here's what we're going to accomplish. And I think, the climate action and adaptation plan, definitely, we're going to get that accomplished, this whole thing. But review climate action adaptation plan progress annually. We should be doing that at practically every meeting. I mean, it just starts to sound, I just lose all sense of urgency in what we're really doing. That once a year we'll sit down and look at the plan and gee, it's going okay, or it's not. And it just seems like a too casual thing. So I think putting something in about advising, bringing to council advice on, and I like how Stephanie had phrased it, because I think making those specific comments, and some of these have come up, we discussed this quite a while ago, so some of these have come up more recently, but I think that's because urgency has clocked up quite a bit more, and we can see more clearly from the consultants' input, and from our own involvement outside of the committee, that certain directions are very critical and that we need to address quickly. Or, as someone's pointed out to me, you let things happen that then put in 50-year cycles of the wrong thing happening before you can correct them. So I think that's important to get across to the city council, that because that's who the audience is for this, right? The city council. Yeah, that we have these very deliberate concerns that we're pursuing, other than just doing the climate action plan.
Just one last point of clarification, and I know it's getting late. Doing a progress report on a climate action plan is a tremendous amount of work. So it's not something that you just every month do. So doing an annual review is actually a big deal, but it means in the plan we put in place metrics and targets so that we can track and get that data. And then, we do a formal public progress report once a year. And that's what's embodied in that point there. So it's actually quite a bit of effort and an important one. And I don't know of any city anywhere that does that more frequently than once a year.
Yeah, I agree, because the cap, it could say things like, you know, that it's aspiration to electrify the city. But there's not, you know, I doubt there's going to be something, you know, detailed, specific, like how we're going to get there. And I think that's part of the role of this committee, is to say, you know, we're going to work on figuring this out. You know, and we're going to work on figuring out how to address the transportation issue in the city. You know, like 2 major initiatives that we would do in the next 2 years that are in collaboration with the CAP and are connected to the CAP, but are coming up with specific things that I don't think are going to come out of the work that the consultants are going to give us. I think there'll be some measures, but major things like that, there's a lot of other parts and pieces to it that may not be detailed in the CAP. How do you get there?
So I think that if we're calling these goals, policy review, and initiatives, to me, an initiative is not a review, that's an activity. I think an initiative is like we're doing something more specific than a review. As it currently stands, the title of our committee is the Climate Action Committee. And the 2 biggest things that I keep going back to are transportation emissions, which are passenger vehicles primarily, and natural gas. So if we're focusing on those 2 things, I would suggest that we include a measure such as make significant progress on innovative policy measures to reduce natural gas and transportation emissions, period, because that's something more tangible, and it's something that we can evaluate at the end of the year. Have we made significant progress? I don't think that, you know, just saying we've reviewed the adaptation plan or we've reviewed options is really saying much at all. Similarly, I don't think that considering waste reduction efforts is an initiative. I think that's a very weak statement. I don't know what that means. And I don't think that waste options is the priority of this committee. And I personally believe very strongly that it is appropriate for us to have a very laser beam focus on a few things and not try to solve everything. Although everything is important, for sure, and adaptation and everything, resilience. But I think we can only do so much in a monthly meeting. And I just reiterate, I believe strongly we should focus on reducing the largest sources of emissions, which are transportation and natural gas. So I feel that these are very, very watered down, and I don't know what to make of these. But I'm not sure. I mean, obviously, we reviewed them before, so I think we're all kind of, you know, partly responsible. But that's, I mean, that would be my position.
Can I just ask a quick question I mean, some of you have a lot more experience on this than I do and some of the other people. Are you concerned that if we don't say it more specifically that the city council is somehow going to inhibit us from doing something? Or are you thinking about sending a more clear message to the city council about using this as a messaging tool? I'm not quite clear.
I think it's a messaging tool to city council. It's also for ourselves. I mean, is this what we want to stand behind as a mission for our policy review and initiatives for the calendar year? It doesn't seem to be very strong to me. It doesn't seem to be commensurate with the magnitude of what is before us, or what we, you know, should at least aspire to do. We may not make, I mean, it's been proven to be very difficult to make significant progress, but I think we should set our bar high rather than not set it high.
And this is for 2 years. It's not something we do every year. It's right. What we're going to be focused on for the next 2 years.
Right. And I tend to agree with what you've been saying. I took that first sentence as saying basically, yeah, it's up to us what we do, and we just go for it. But maybe that's not the right way to read it, because that's why I was asking my question about, you know, feedback. This is the only time we get a chance to talk amongst ourselves. So okay, so those are really good comments about tightening that up and giving more of a message about action and urgency. So what do we, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, how do we go about making these edits? And also, just to clarify, it is possible to make changes after it's been approved by city council. So it isn't, I mean, we obviously want it to be our final draft, but if there is something that is different in the future.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to make changes after the cap is approved by city council, and add some detail and specificity to this, I think that would be appropriate to bring it back to council. We had talked about maybe that not being necessary because council will ultimately approve the plan. So anything that you'd be working on within the confines of the plan would probably be, acceptable. Also, to clarify, there's going to be a climate action plan and there's going to be an implementation plan. And the implementation plan will have some detail and specificity to it, so.
And then in terms of these edits, is it possible to see them, in front of us so we can actually approve them now? So some of the suggestions that have been made.
Yes, I guess, I mean, I can read you what I have and maybe you guys can discuss them one at a time and I can, right now they're not fully fleshed out, but.
Before you do that, let me ask a procedural question. Is there a time constraint that this council is expecting this to be submitted? When
Yeah,
is that?
it's scheduled for May 20th.
Is after our next meeting. but just-
It's after your next meeting, but the packet is due before.
Got it. So we need to finalize this today. So then can we continue with going through the proposed edits?
Maybe I'll read them all. I don't know how to do this, but these are my notes. I don't know if they make sense. Support policies to phase natural gas out in the near term. Support all electric new homes by 2020. Exploration of a parking permit policy. Recommend near-term actions to city council to address climate change, such as restricting natural gas in new building construction, implementing a utility users tax, et cetera. Make significant progress to reduce natural gas and transportation emissions. And Tom, you had sent them something at the beginning that I didn't get.
Well,
About outreach.
I just raised the issue about implementation and, how, recommendations to council for action related to that, related to some of the goals that we have.
Yeah, thank you, Claire, for reading out your notes. I know we're running out of steam. It sounded like some of the points were captured in multiple notes.
Yeah.
So if
We don't need to put all that in.
Right, if I recap something like advise council on near-term actions, near-term climate actions, such as restricting natural gas, reducing transportation emissions, implementing a utility users tax, etc. That kind of captures all of those. And also has the urgency, near-term actions, and also has the more active verb of advise. And then if we could also have the name of the committee, the Sustainability Committee. That was the other point.
I wouldn't put that in this. That's a political battle that, you would bring forward somewhere else, I think. I mean,
I think maybe not specifically in the work plan, but presenting this to council does give us the opportunity to mention
yeah.
we're not satisfied with the name.
Well, or anyway, there's a big
Thank you for
history on
putting
that.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, Stephanie, so I got advise council on near-term actions to address climate change such as, and then I just copied and pasted this, but you said a third item on here.
Oh, I had restricting natural gas,
Transportation.
reducing
Utility tax.
transportation emissions, and utility users tax. I think that got all of like our big ticket items,
et cetera.
et cetera.
Claire, for the second to last one, I was just suggesting make significant progress on policy measures to reduce natural gas and transportation emissions.
Thanks, you guys are noticing what I don't capture.
But that's similar to the last one. It's just a,
Yeah, I was
Maybe it's
trying
a-
to put them all together in just one more line item.
The last one to me is saying we're advising council. Second, the last one seems to be like we're
target.
making progress with
Yeah.
council because we brought things to council, we've advised council. Not a whole lot of success, at least on the UUT.
Yeah,
That's a distinction in my mind.
got it.
You know, one thing we can do is we can make the changes that you're talking about this evening. We can send it out to you. You can't interact among yourselves about it, but if in that final draft you had, as individuals, wanted to communicate a clarifying comment, I think that would be appropriate. As long as you're not interacting as a committee, we can give you a chance to make any last-minute changes.
I think that's a good solution.
I mean, you have to decide on the language, but one of these two last statements here capture most of what you're saying, so we don't need to add more items? And also, does that mean that some of the items on the list can be taken off? For instance, review options for potential modifications to building construction regulations might be taken off if you have this statement instead.
Right, I agree.
So we're talking about adding
Do
those
we
two
want
that
to
are
look at
highlighted there.
the statements and tag ones that we think?
Sorry, what?
Well, if we add these two,
Do you want both, or do you want something that says advise council and make significant progress on?
Yeah.
Great.
yeah.
I don't know, Max, is that what Max, it sounded like you were saying, do one where we're making sure that we are telling them we're going to advise, and another one where we say we're going to make progress.
Yeah, just to try to set our bar a little bit higher.
I mean, it feels like keeping it as two separate things would be more impactful,
Yeah.
rather than trying to make one long sentence that says everything. I kind of like the way it was two different sentences. I mean, you made a good point about.
How about saying advise council on action that will make significant progress on near-term solutions to climate change?
I think that still takes away a little bit from the specific goal of making progress.
Yeah, I think it's a different concept.
Yeah, well, you don't want to say action twice, so.
Given the time, maybe I would move to
Yeah.
just let us think about it, and maybe we'll just have to interact with Claire individually. But I think this is a good start, at least.
Right. My final comment about what's on the current list is it has a thing that says promote carbon-free Albany challenge. We're not really, there's nothing else listed as promoting, and I don't really know what that means. I mean, we could say promoting change in lifestyle of citizens in Albany. So
Yeah, I almost think that's,
I don't know what that
there's
means.
something different than, I got that feeling too, some different word than promote. What we should really do is develop, a strategy to increase involvement by citizens in that platform.
And make it broader, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think to Max's point, we should go through Claire instead of, continuing to do this here. But before we finish up, we do need to designate members of the committee to present to council on the 20th.
I would make a motion
Typically,
that
that's the chair.
and the vice
Yeah.
chair. Should I just make a motion that the chair and the vice chair
Yep.
present the work plan to the city council?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
I'd like to clarify exactly what we're doing, and I think because you can't talk about this again, I think we should definitely clarify. So that my proposed changes are adding these two things. There's some redundancy here, but if you're okay with that, then we'll just leave it. And then taking out any of the bullets that address those things directly. And not making any other changes. That's what I've heard.
We could just look at them quickly and see if they're ones we can just all agree go away. Want to?
You mean on here?
Do we have them in front of us? Yeah, yeah. So, yeah. So the third,
So you're talking about taking the third one out?
Yep.
Because that one struck me
would
as
take
one
the-
that was actually pretty action-oriented.
Yeah, I think we need to do that.
well,
We can keep it, it's just that the two other bullets you're adding are also speaking to the same thing. So then you have three bullets speaking to the same thing.
well, and we've just been told that making modifications to building construction regulations is impossible anyway, so.
No,
But
no, I don't think that's what we heard.
I guess we should just get this, we can look at it and individually just line out the one.
Okay, so I will leave all of these and I'll add the other two bullets. Okay.
And then we'll individually send our suggestions, and you will see the consensus emerge. Thank you.
Any public comment?
And yeah, do you want to make a deadline for us to send those comments to you? I know that we're putting a lot of extra work on.
To be honest, I'm not sure that I can, I know you said we can take comments, but I'm not sure that I can decide on a consensus.
Well, do what we can. If we have to reschedule city council action on this, we will. So that it's at a later meeting, so you can have another discussion about it. I think you're probably spending more time on this than you really need to. I think it's a good exercise for you to think through these things and talk about it. It's a good exercise for the council. I don't know that you need to spend a ton more time on it. I think we kind of catch the drift. And
I don't think we've ever had a situation where staff told us you can't do that because it's not in your work plan. We've had things where you've said that's outside the scope of the committee, but I haven't heard things where you said.
other committees have had situations where council's very clear, this is what we want you to work on, these are the three things, and then they go do a fourth thing, and then, yeah, that goes. But you're right, I don't think in this case.
That didn't answer your question, other than I'm a little uncomfortable
Okay.
taking feedback, honestly. But, I mean, we need it by the first week in May, probably, if you want to give us anything.
Well, and then you're going to send out, like, after you get the feedback, you're going to send out one last draft of it to everybody and say, this is what we're doing, any strong objections, right?
That constitutes a decision.
Yeah, at that point, we would just be, I think the flow of information needs to be one way.
Yeah.
And at that point, we would just put it on the agenda for the next meeting.
Is anyone opposed to if I make a motion that we accept these plus the two that we just added right now, and we just get it over with, and so it's a little wordy, who cares?
Yeah.
You do object.
Yeah.
I don't object.
Oh.
I wonder if it'd be appropriate to say that, like, we want to keep that, but if there's any way that you guys want to rework the wording a little bit, no?
No. If we can make a decision here, then we're done, and then we just present it. If you guys are okay presenting it with those and the two that we added.
Are you okay with that? I'm okay with that.
So I make a motion that we approve the 2019-2021 work plan to include the items that are on here, plus the two that Claire just wrote up that were dictated to her by the committee.
I can second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, and then that adjourns our meeting.